loved his kids, and he'll give you the shirt off his back. When we got the news, I got to like a corner, and I just balled up, man, and was just crying because I couldn't believe it.
He spotted someone sort of pop out from behind the house wearing all black.
Multiple gunshots ring out, followed by the sound of screeching tires.
He felt very disrespected, and so he wanted revenge.
He's been humiliated. You've got to retaliate.
He was so angry, so bent on getting one guy that he didn't care who else had to get hurt.
I found it pretty chilling. He showed absolutely no remorse.
The city of Rock Hill, South Carolina, sits just 20 miles south of Charlotte.
The Rock Hill community is grown up around the downtown area, and then, of course, neighborhoods keep building out of that. And so the neighborhoods closest to downtown are the oldest ones, and then things that begin to push out towards York and Charlotte and Fort Mill, some of the newer, more modern type neighborhoods. But overall, the whole community is very focused on sports, athletics, great school system, lots of parks and playgrounds, and generally a really great place to raise a family.
On August 9th, 2015, it's around 11 p.m. when multiple calls come into the Rock Hill Police Department's 911 dispatch center.
At this time, the neighbors heard 8 to 9 gunshots ringing out. No one knows what's going on. There's chaos on the scene.
Noise complaints are extremely frequent, especially in the Frank Street area. Hearing gunshots also is not infrequent, even if it's just something innocent like someone shooting in their backyard for fun. But in this case, the noise complaint coincided with gunshots. There happened to be other officers nearby who heard those as well.
And they heard multiple gunshots ring out, followed by the sound of screeching tires.
The officers who are already close by are able to get over to Frank Street pretty quickly.
There were quite a number of people around the victim who was in the front yard.
They find a man laying in the grass, face first, bleeding from his head with an apparent gunshot wound.
He was shot twice, once in his arm and once in the head.
It appeared he saw the shooter and threw up his arms to block the shot, but when he was shot in the head, he immediately went down.
They located a faint pulse on him. He was still alive at the scene at the time.
They roll him over to administer first aid, and they find the gun underneath him.
The gun was just lying between him and the ground. It was a handgun, so it was pretty clear that he had either been holding it or it had fallen out of his waistband where he fell. But they did just treat him right there until the medics arrived.
Since the .380 caliber gun was found underneath Anthony, police think that he was carrying it.
They didn't know exactly what had happened, but one, it's not unusual for people in that neighborhood to carry weapons for protection, and two, it could have easily been assumed that he and another person were possibly shooting at each other. They wouldn't have known that until they got the area cleared and were able to begin searching for spent shell casings. He also had his South Carolina identification in his pocket.
The man is identified as 30-year-old Anthony DeMond Hart.
The victim's still alive. They're trying to work him, trying to save him. He is transported to a hospital in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Many of the people who are out in the street know Anthony, and so word gets around pretty quickly.
They called me and it was like, man, Anthony just got shot. I was like, what? So, like I said, I got the keys, took off to the hospital. His friends was there and family was there. It was kind of a couple laughs at first, just joking about things in the past, but because we didn't know the severity of it.
Anthony Hart was born on August 12, 1984.
Anthony was born and raised in Rock Hill. He lived there his whole life.
He got a little brother. He kind of took him under his wing. You know how it is growing up with sisters and brothers. You yelling at them and fussing and fighting. You know, it's always yelling. Somebody yelling at somebody. Anthony act just like his father. His father is loud, just like Anthony was loud. His mother, she was laid back. We met in high school. If I could describe him with one word, it'd be loud. You knew Anthony was somewhere nearby and didn't even see him, but you heard him.
Anthony had a lot of friends. He played sports and his mom's house was always filled. He had a lot of personality and a really big heart.
The list goes on with very kind, hard moments he did. And he'll give you the shirt off his back. Me and Anthony graduated in 2002. Anthony went straight into the work field. We both did, kind of started working right after high school. When it came down to it, to pay the bills, we were hard workers.
He became a father in his early 20s, and then he went on to have 2 more kids.
He has 2 boys and a little girl. He loved his children. He was a great, great family man. He was a great father.
Anthony eventually went to school to be an electrician. He thought that would be a good career and he would be able to support his kids. So when he wasn't with his kids or working, he liked to hang out with his friends in the neighborhood.
In our free time, we played cards. We loved to gamble. We might gamble on who walking in the door next. But it was mainly cards, dice, stuff like that, football games. We would gamble on anything.
He was a good guy who worked hard and kept a low profile. He loved his kids and would help anyone who needed it.
He was one of those guys that you just wouldn't expect to have no drama, you know, no beef.
On the night of August 9th, 2015, word that Anthony had been shot shocks his friends and family. They gather at a hospital in Charlotte, where they wait for an update.
Mama and Daddy, they were there because we didn't know, you know, the situation at first. Everybody kind of was filling in what was going on, so I kind of got filled in when I got there.
Anthony was shot in his left temple and twice in his left forearm. Apparently, Anthony was trying to block the shots with his forearm, and Anthony then died not long after he arrived at the hospital. The shot to the temple proved fatal.
When we got the news that he had passed away, man, it was just like chaos everywhere. Everybody started screaming and crying. I remember me personally, you know, I got to like a corner and I just balled up, man, and was just crying because I couldn't believe it. We just all just broke. It was terrifying.
Back in Rock Hill, homicide detectives arrive on Frank Street.
I do not know exactly if it was during transport or very shortly after. I remember that we had not been on the scene all that long before we were notified that he had died.
This seemed as a regular shooting call, but after he died, it took it to a whole different level. It was now a homicide case.
We located 7 shell casings that were of a .22 caliber. They were all near the back of the house, though. There were none near Anthony or his, where he fell. The shooting had happened from sort of the back side of the house towards the side of it, which would have given a direct line of sight to the roadway where he was located.
The casings looked like they were from some type of long gun or rifle. They all appeared to come from the same weapon.
But not from the .380 found underneath Anthony.
It was apparent that his weapon had not been fired. It was fully loaded. There were obviously no spent casings around him.
It was pretty clear that he was carrying a gun, probably for his own protection, but he never had a chance to fire it in his defense.
Police speak with the witnesses.
People had fled the area after the shooting happened for fear of their safety. But there were quite a number of people who had been inside the home there playing some cards that night, just hanging out, sort of having a kickback, as they call it. And they were all mostly outside looking at the situation.
One of them is a man named Roderick Wright.
Mr. Wright was just a longtime friend of the victim, Mr. Hart, and he was another one of the persons there that evening playing cards and hanging out.
Roderick tells investigators that Anthony had also been in the house.
So they were just generally hanging out that evening. I don't know how long they had been playing, but at some point he stepped outside, I guess, to get some fresh air.
Roderick went with him.
He was speaking with his friend Roderick Wright, and they were just catching up outside the home where there was a card game going on.
And as they were speaking, Roderick spotted someone sort of pop out from behind the back of the house, wearing all black.
It seemed weird, and it put both of them on edge.
He saw that person step back behind the house, and he said to Mr. Hart, let's go back inside. They began to walk back into the house out of concern for this man that he saw in the shadows.
So Anthony hesitated for a minute, and then he said, I got to get something out of my car.
Anthony went to his vehicle. We don't know for sure what he did, but our assumption is that he got his handgun out of the vehicle to protect himself and his friend as they were then going to go back inside the house where they would feel more safe. And then they were turning to go walk back inside.
Before they could get inside, the man reemerged.
This man stepped back out from the side of the house again and indiscriminately opened fire.
There was just gunshots, one after the other, just out of the blue.
Rock Hill, South Carolina police are investigating the shooting death of 30-year-old Anthony Hart. Investigators on the scene speak with Anthony's friend and witness to the shooting, Roderick Wright.
A man came from the side of the house, dressed in all black, just opened up fire to start shooting, and he said he panicked and fled the scene.
He was definitely on edge and scared and had gotten his car and sped away. So it was a very traumatic moment for him.
The witness stated that he fled from the scene in fear of getting shot himself. So as soon as he heard that the coast was clear, he came back.
Roderick's statement helps investigators develop a theory.
If someone is dressed in all black with a weapon, sneaking up behind the house, the theories would then be that they were there to intentionally rob or kill someone. It wasn't a random act of violence. It wasn't like an argument that went sideways. And because there was a card game going on inside the house where money was being used in the betting, it was assumed that possibly the suspect was there to rob the people of their money at the card game.
Other witnesses who'd been at the card game report that one man left early and angry.
Sean Durham had been at the card game and lost his money and left angry and upset that he had lost the money. And it was assumed that he had come back to rob everyone to take back his money. That was the initial rumor that was circulating in the streets, and we heard that from many different people that night.
But Roderick can't say one way or another whether Sean was the shooter.
Roderick was only able to say that the suspect was wearing all black because the backside of those houses on Frank Street is very dark, especially that late at night. Very few of them have any back porch lights. And so it would have been pitch black, and Roderick would have been looking from a well-lit position in the street into darkness, and so he would not have been able to give any sort of a positive identification of the shooter.
They actually find Sean and talk to him. He admits that he left angry, but insists that he had nothing to do with the murder. He says that he went to a friend's house and stayed there the rest of the night.
Sean is still a suspect this time, but he could be lying about his alibi, so this time he's just a person of interest.
There's nothing connecting him to the shooting. No proof.
Detectives plan to follow up on Sean's alibi. In the meantime, more tips come in.
Investigators learned about a shooting that happened a week prior, and they said figuring out that this could be connected to the shooting.
On August 2nd, a man opened fire on a home on Frank Street, just 3 houses down from the scene of Anthony's shooting.
A male subject came in the evening, stood in the front yard, and opened fire into the house through the front windows of the house.
There were 9 people inside the home. Based on witness statements of individuals inside the home, It appears that one of the first or second rounds caused the blinds, the window dressings to fall. There were two small children, toddlers really, who were playing in the floor of the living room. He continued to fire multiple rounds into the house before fleeing the scene.
There were several people at home at the time, including a grandmother, a pregnant woman, and children.
Somehow, no one was killed.
The shooting was immediately reported by the family that lived there. The male subject inside had either been grazed by a bullet or by glass, and so he needed some medical treatment. The family was clearly traumatized by the shooting.
Investigators identified a suspect in the shooting.
One of the residents of that home. She did not know his name, but she knew him to go by Q.
The next day, by utilizing the nicknames that had been given to us, we were able to produce a photo lineup, go back to the family, and one of the young women was willing to cooperate with us and identify him as the shooter.
They learned that his real name is Quinteris Miller, and he was just 17 years old.
Based on her identification and the other evidence collected in the investigation, Miller was charged with those 9 counts of attempted murder and discharging a firearm into dwelling. Police were able to obtain warrants for his arrest on those charges, but he evaded police.
We knew that through tips that he had gone back to Chester and was in hiding. And so we contacted the City of Chester Police and the Chester County Sheriff's Department and let them know that, he was wanted for an attempted murder, and they began doing surveillance and looking for him.
There's no clear connection between these two incidents, just rumors.
When we see these crimes happen in the neighborhoods, we know that there are witnesses, but oftentimes people don't want to speak up because of their distrust for law enforcement, for one, and that relationship has been strained. In addition to that, they're fearful of retaliation.
You have 2 shootings just a few houses away from each other within a week. Are they connected? The only way to find out is to find Quinteris and talk to him.
After 30-year-old Anthony Hart dies during a shooting in his Rock Hill neighborhood, police look to question the suspect in another shooting, Quinteris Miller.
He allegedly shot into a house full of people, which included a toddler and a senior citizen. There's a warrant for his arrest now, but now he's on the run.
Word on the street is that the 2 shootings are connected.
People are saying that the same person who shot up the house shot Anthony, but police don't know if that's true, and if that's true, what the connection might be.
As police continue to hunt for Quinteris, they take a closer look at the first shooting.
The family did tell us that it happened probably because of the fight that took place there in their front yard earlier that day. The family made the connection for us because they knew that Quinteris was present at both incidents.
On August 2nd, a man by the name of Swadarius Beatty got into an argument or a fight of some sort with his girlfriend at the time.
Beatty's girlfriend is Quinteris Miller's sister.
He received a call from his sister that she was there, and so he went over there to help protect his sister.
Quinteris Miller arrived on Frank Street with a group of other people to confront Mr. Beatty about the altercation with his sister. During that confrontation, things escalated.
A young woman got out some pepper spray, and she sprayed Quinteris' sister and everyone who was in her car. Quinteris got mad about that and hit the pepper spray out of the young woman's hand. Well, that was Beatty's sister. So Beatty got mad and attacked Quinteris with the brick.
Suddenly, Beatty hits him in the face with a brick and knocks him unconscious.
And then he began to, again, hit Quinteris more times while he was unconscious.
The witness goes on to tell police that some good Samaritans jumped in to help.
There were two individuals about two houses down, a father and son, who were sitting on their porch and observing this go down in front of the houses on Frank Street. And after Mr. Miller had been knocked unconscious, Beatty was on top of him and continued to assault him. These two men got up and ran to help Mr. Miller, and they were able to effectively get Beatty off of him.
Anthony and his dad ran over and broke up the fight. And then Quinteris' sister and their friends were able to drag him into a car and get him out of there. No one was charged for anything that took place there because all the parties did not want to cooperate or press charges.
Rumor has it that Quinteris left the incident humiliated.
Beatty essentially got the best of Mr. Miller.
He felt very disrespected by the fact that he had been hit with the brick, and so he wanted revenge.
So at this point, Quinteris is embarrassed. He's been humiliated. Here you've come to help your sister, but you underestimated what you were walking into. So you expected to come in and save your sister, but instead, really someone had to save you. So now he's got to figure out what is he going to do to eliminate that, to make sure that he's not going to be made fun of, that people are not going to lose respect for him. Because oftentimes that's what it's about. It's about respect. And whether someone's going to challenge you or not, you've got to come back and make sure that you reestablish and retaliate for what has happened to you.
Miller returns to Frank Street and he approaches the house there, and standing approximately 10 feet from the living room window, he opens fire with a pistol into the home.
Swaderis lived in that home with several family members, so it's suspected that Quinteris was just shooting into the home hoping to hit Swaderis. It's clear what happened there that day, but what does any of this have to do with Anthony Hart?
On August 13th, we got an anonymous tip.
The tipster says she overheard a disturbing conversation between Quinteris and two other men, Gabriel Mobley and Xavier Thompson, the night before Anthony's murder.
She heard the Miller and the others discussing what he had on his mind that night, that he needed a rifle to hit a lick, which is a term that essentially means that he wants to commit some sort of crime.
Gabriel says his brother has a rifle that he offers to Quinteris.
Gabriel Mobley retrieved the gun from inside the house and gave it to Mr. Miller.
The tipster says the men left the house immediately.
All three young men, Gabriel, Xavier, and Quinteris, left with the gun towards Frank Street.
Moments later, the tipster says she heard gunfire.
Witnesses say she heard gunshots. We know that this is the same day and time that Anthony was shot. And we know that three men headed in the same direction. And this is the same gun that killed Anthony.
Investigators are on the hunt for 17-year-old Quinteris Miller, a suspect in multiple crimes, including the murder of Anthony Hart.
A tipster tells police that Gabriel Mobley gave Quinteris a rifle that he may have used to kill Anthony, so they searched his home.
Because he was on probation, we had the right to search him and his house based on this tip that we got. And so we searched the house thoroughly, and we found a box of .22 caliber ammunition that had been intentionally hidden in the bathroom.
After searching the home, investigators found the bullets that matches the crime scene, but they don't find the gun that killed Anthony Hart.
He could not possess any ammunition at the time, so he was in trouble for that on the probation side of things.
They're getting closer, but there's still so many unanswered questions. Like, why would Quinteris kill Anthony? It just made no sense.
Then, on August 19th, investigators get the chance to ask him.
We knew that through tips that he had gone back to Chester and was in hiding. And so we contacted the City of Chester Police and the Chester County Sheriff's Department, let them know that, he was wanted for an attempted murder, and they began doing surveillance and looking for him.
Quinteris was arrested in Chester, then transported to Rock Hill Police Department.
They spotted him getting into a car in downtown Chester. They just simply pulled him over and he gave no problems. They arrested him and transported him up to Rock Hill for us.
At that point, Quinteris was arrested for attempted murder charges for shooting up the house.
Quinteris agrees to an interview.
He freely told us about the fight that happened in the morning, but then he denied having come back to shoot up Mr. Beatty's house that evening.
He denies involvement in any of the shootings.
Instead, he offers up an alibi.
He denied any involvement, but he did admit that he was in Rock Hill that day, that he was with the Mobleys, and he had claimed that he was playing video games with Gabriel Mobley at the time of the shooting.
And then once we got to the questioning of the murder, he requested a lawyer and he ended the interview and did not discuss that at all. We informed the family of updates of the case as it was going along. So once we had arrested Quinteris for the first shooting, that's when we spoke to the family.
Anthony's dad is familiar with the house where Quinteris allegedly opened fire after the fight.
He and Anthony had friends who lived a couple of houses down from where the incident took place.
It was a very common place for them to be, and that's when he remembered.
He and his son, Anthony, they witnessed a fight on Frank Street.
Anthony's father put two and two together and let me know that he and Anthony had actually intervened in that fight. Because to him, he didn't know that it had anything to do with the murder, and so he didn't think to mention it because it's not uncommon to find teenagers, fighting in the streets. During the fight, Quinteris Miller was knocked unconscious, but the male subject who was assaulting him did not stop hitting him even though he was unconscious. So Anthony and his father intervened to prevent Mr. Miller from getting more injuries while he was unconscious on the ground, and they helped break up the fight.
This is it. This is the connection between the two shootings, but it doesn't make sense.
If Anthony tried to help Quinteris, why would Quinteris seek Anthony out and gun him down?
Meanwhile, a former suspect in Anthony's murder is also in custody on unrelated charges.
Sometime shortly after the murder, Sean Durham was arrested on a completely separate case.
Sean was considered a suspect early on because he got angry and stormed out of the card game when he lost money.
While he was in the York County Detention Center, he was not given a bond for his charges. And he desperately wanted a bond, and so he volunteered to work with the police to clear his name, because obviously he had heard the rumors that he was being named as the shooter in Anthony's case. And so he and his lawyer were cooperative with the police.
On August 24th, Sean and his attorney reach out to detectives.
Sean Durham, he volunteers to help police get Quinteris to confess.
He stated that if he was put in a room with Miller, he felt sure that he could get Miller to talk about it and to admit that he was the shooter in that case. They arranged to have both Miller and Mr. Durham transported from the jail to the law center in Rock Hill, which is where the Rock Hill Police Department is located. They placed a camera and some audio recording equipment in a room. They brought Mr. Miller and Durham into that room.
You don't want to feel that.
On August 28th, 2015, police in Rock Hill, South Carolina, listen in as Sean Durham attempts to pull a murder confession out of Quinteris Miller.
Quinteris and Sean are placed in a room alone together with a hidden recording device.
The investigators then went to another room where they watched, I believe, a live feed from the camera as Durham spoke with Miller about the incident. And it was that conversation between Miller and Durham that really sealed Q Miller's fate. He asked him, were you just trying to get one under your belt, meaning a murder, taking a life? And Miller just shook his head and laughed.
It would have given Quinteris a lot of street cred. And so he seemed quite happy to talk about the murder with Sean. Sean was able to get Quinteris to open up and talk about the murder because Quinteris would have thought that his information would be safe with Sean. Quinteris looked up to and respected Sean. They ran in the same circles, had the same friends, had been through a lot together.
How many shell casings they found?
And they said they found like 7, 8.
Sean really just approached Quinteris from a position of being sort of excited about hearing the details of the case.
Sean starts pushing. He starts getting at the question that police really want answered. Why? And what Quinteris says is a complete shock.
Why? It would be wrong.
And he asked him, he said, you mean you killed the wrong person? And again, he laughed and nodded his head.
That it wasn't even meant for him. That's crazy, man.
He then went on to talk about who the intended target was, that it was Mr. Beatty, and the reason why he was seeking retribution against him for being assaulted and getting knocked out a week before.
Quinteris admitted that he accidentally shot the wrong guy because he thought Anthony was the man who hit him, where in actuality it was Swandarius Beatty who hit him.
Quinteris thought he was returning back to the same house he'd previously shot up, where Swandarius lived.
He still had revenge on his mind, and so he essentially decided he wanted to go back and finish what he had started.
We're talking about a boy who's probably never done anything this serious before. He's walking through an extremely dark area. His eyes may not be adjusted correctly. He was actually several houses down. Quinteris essentially said that he just popped out. He started spraying, which means just shooting the weapon at the two people that he saw.
He mistakenly believed that one of those two men was Mr. Beatty.
You just went from White House.
He indiscriminately opened fire on these two individuals, striking, one of the bullets struck Mr. Hart in the head and killed him.
Oh, one got hit. Damn, bro. That's crazy, man.
Quinteris knew that he had not killed Beatty, but it didn't have much of an impact on him as to who he had actually killed.
You know where the time from? Come.
I found it pretty chilling, too, that he showed absolutely no remorse. To find out that you mistakenly killed an innocent man, someone you didn't even know, and to show no contrition or remorse, I thought was particularly chilling about Mr. Miller.
Even more chilling is the fact that Anthony attempted to help Quinteris.
The real tragic irony in this case is that the man that he mistakenly shot, Anthony Hart, was one of the two individuals who saved him a week before when he was being assaulted in front of the houses on Frank Street. Anthony Hart intervened for Miller.
Investigators finally have what they need.
Once we heard Quinteris give that information, it confirmed for us that this was all tied back to the August 2nd shooting at Beatty's home. This was just a 16-year-old who wanted revenge because he got hit in the fist with a brick. It really just made the whole thing that much more tragic.
With that confession, that was enough for officers then to charge Mr. Miller with the murder of Anthony Hart at that time. Under South Carolina law, he was an adult, so he was tried and prosecuted as an adult.
Following a taped confession, Quinteris Miller faces over 20 charges, including murder and multiple accounts of attempted murder. Investigators continue to work the case, interviewing his alleged accomplices in the murder, Xavier Thompson and Gabriel Mobley.
G. Mobley and Xavier Thompson went with Quinteris to commit the crime.
They put one another as the accomplice to Quinteris, and they tried to protect themselves. And so Xavier ultimately said it was Gabriel and Quinteris who went to go do the shooting. Gabriel said no, it was Xavier and Quinteris who went to do the shooting. So they were being somewhat cooperative, but it was hard to tell which one was telling the truth. It seemed a little bit more spur of the moment for Xavier and Gabriel to be involved in the case. It seemed like they were going along with their friend because it might have been an exciting thing. Maybe they didn't know exactly what he intended to do, although he did take a firearm to go do a lick. They weren't completely unaware.
They tell investigators that they dumped the gun in the woods.
They hid the gun somewhere. We never did find the murder weapon.
Prosecutors don't want to take any chances. They offer Quinteris the opportunity to plea.
Because we did not have direct physical evidence like fingerprints or DNA. There was no video of him committing it. That would still be a strong case, but not a guaranteed one.
For months, Quinteris and his attorneys refuse.
Well, the case was a little bit more than a year old, and we had been unable to reach a plea agreement. The case was set for trial in the early part of 2017. It was actually not until just days before this trial was scheduled to start on a Monday morning that we received confirmation from Mr. Miller's attorney that he wanted to accept our offer to plead guilty. Miller wanted to plead guilty under the doctrine of North Carolina versus Alford, so he did not actually have to admit his guilt, but he acknowledged that there was substantial evidence against him enough that there's a substantial likelihood that a jury would find him guilty. And with the evidence confirmed against him, he accepted the state's offer and pled guilty for the negotiated sentence of 30 years. He cannot be released early, he cannot make parole.
Quinteris does not make a statement or give any details of his crimes.
He was so angry, so bent on getting one guy that he didn't care who else had to get hurt along the way for him to get that revenge against just one person. So in his case, an entire family was traumatized. There were an elderly woman and a pregnant woman and children who their lives were put at risk when Quinteris shot up their home. Obviously, an innocent man, Anthony, lost his life over this, and ultimately, Quinteris never got the revenge he wanted.
Part of the tragedy is that he didn't just take Anthony Hart's life, he threw his own life away. And over something as just trivial as being knocked out in a fight. You know, I think that it's clear from his actions, mistakenly shooting the wrong person, that he is a very dangerous person. And his propensity for violence is obvious. From the facts and the evidence in the case.
Anthony's killer was caught, and he is getting the consequences for what he did to Anthony. But I'm sure that his family would rather have Anthony alive today than, another young man in prison.
There's just something about Anthony Hart acting as a good Samaritan and intervening for this man who ultimately killed him that just would be so hard for me, I think, to stomach as a family member.
Like, this guy literally was helping you out, and you not paying attention, or you just filled with rage and want a retaliation, just come out and just start shooting, and not knowing you just took the life of the guy that helped you out. It was crazy. It was just stupid. That shows you what type of person Anthony is. A very, kind person, will give you the shirt off his back and, help anybody in need.
The city of Montreal was settling into another ordinary spring night. Traffic lights changed from red to green along busy intersections. Students drifted between apartments and late-night cafes. Office towers reflected the last traces of daylight fading behind the skyline. From a distance, everything appeared normal. The city breathed with the familiar rhythm of millions of lives moving forward at once. Yet somewhere inside that vast urban landscape, a chain of events had already begun that would soon shock not only Canada, but the entire world. At first, there was no crime scene tape, no emergency sirens, no breaking news alerts. There was only silence. The kind of silence that settles around a missing person before anyone realizes they are missing. The kind of silence that hides danger in plain sight. Days later, investigators would find themselves staring at evidence so disturbing that veteran officers struggled to comprehend what they were looking at. Journalists would race to piece together a story that seemed more like fiction than reality. Internet users from different countries would discover that clues had been scattered online long before authorities understood what they meant. But on that night, none of those people knew what was coming. What they could not see was that the story had begun long before a victim disappeared, long before police became involved, long before international headlines carried a single name. Because this was not simply the story of a murder. It was the story of obsession, an obsession with attention, an obsession with fame, an obsession so powerful that it appeared capable of consuming every boundary between reality and performance. The man at the center of that obsession had spent years searching for recognition. He wanted to be noticed. He wanted strangers to know his face. He wanted people to talk about him. Again and again, he tried to place himself in front of an audience. Photographs, profiles, stories, images carefully crafted to project a version of himself that seemed larger than life. To outsiders, it sometimes looked pathetic. To others, it seemed harmless. Just another person trying too hard to become famous. But beneath the surface, something darker was taking shape. The warning signs existed. Some people noticed them. Many dismissed them. After all, the internet was full of unusual personalities. Full of people exaggerating their lives. Full of individuals desperate for attention. Why would anyone believe this case would become different? Thousands of kilometers away, from where the story would eventually dominate headlines, families were living ordinary lives. Students were planning their futures. Workers were finishing long shifts. Parents were speaking with children about hopes and ambitions. Among those ordinary people was a man named Jun Lin. Friends described him as kind, thoughtful, soft-spoken, the sort of person who rarely became the center of attention. He had traveled far from home to build a future in Canada. Like countless international students, he carried dreams that stretched beyond himself. Education represented opportunity. Opportunity represented possibility. He was building a life, making plans, thinking about tomorrow. What he could not know was that his future was about to intersect with someone whose desires were moving in a completely different direction. A direction fueled not by hope, but by notoriety. As investigators would later discover, this collision between two lives would trigger one of the most infamous criminal cases in modern Canadian history. Yet even that description fails to capture what made this case so unusual. Murders happen every year. Tragic as they are, most remain local stories. This one did not. This case crossed borders. It crossed languages. It crossed continents. People who had never visited Canada became fascinated by it. Television networks followed every development. Newspapers printed photographs on their front pages. Law enforcement agencies in multiple countries became involved. The story seemed to expand with every passing day. And at the center of it all stood a question that haunted everyone trying to understand the crime. Why? Why would someone do this? Why would someone deliberately draw attention to themselves in the aftermath? Why would someone appear to want the world to watch? Those questions would dominate the investigation. But before detectives could answer them, they first had to uncover the truth. And the truth did not arrive all at once. It emerged in fragments. A clue here, a report there, a discovery that raised more questions than answers. Each revelation seemed more shocking than the last. At first, many people refused to believe what they were hearing. Some assumed rumors had been exaggerated. Others believed investigators must be mistaken. Surely reality could not be as disturbing as the stories being told, but reality proved even more unsettling. Because this case was not only about violence, it was about performance, it was about image, it was about the growing relationship between crime and digital culture in a world increasingly shaped by screens. Years earlier, few people would have imagined that online communities could become important parts of a criminal investigation. Yet in this case, Internet users had already noticed troubling behavior before law enforcement connected the dots. Strangers sitting behind computer screens in different countries had been discussing a mysterious figure whose actions disturbed them. Some tried to warn others. Some attempted to identify him. Most never imagined their observations would later become part of a worldwide manhunt. Looking back now, those conversations seem almost eerie, like distant echoes of a disaster still approaching. But hindsight creates clarity. At the time, nobody possessed the complete picture. Nobody understood how the pieces fit together. Nobody knew where the story would end. The city itself offered no clues. Montreal remained beautiful and busy, its streets filled with movement, its neighborhoods alive with conversation, its cafes crowded with students and tourists. The city carried on exactly as it always had, yet somewhere within that ordinary environment, a tragedy was unfolding. One that would leave investigators searching for answers across international borders. One that would force prosecutors to present evidence unlike anything many jurors had ever encountered. One that would leave a grieving family trying to understand how an ordinary day could transform into a nightmare. And one that would forever connect two names in criminal history. June Lin, Luca Magnotta, the victim, and the man accused of taking his life. But before those names appeared together in courtrooms and news reports, they existed in separate worlds. One man focused on building a future, the other increasingly consumed by a desire to create an image. Neither could know how history would remember them. Neither could see the headlines, waiting ahead. Neither could predict the international attention that would soon descend upon Montreal. What followed would become one of the most analyzed criminal investigations of the digital age. A case involving online clues, international cooperation, public fascination, and a relentless search for the truth. It would reveal how modern technology could help investigators, how it could complicate investigations, and how it could transform a local crime into a global story almost overnight. Most importantly, it would remind the world that behind every headline stands a real human being. A person with family, with dreams, with plans for the future. A life interrupted. A life that deserved to be remembered for far more than the crime that ended it. This is where our story begins. Not with the investigation, not with the arrest, not with the courtroom, but with a city unaware of the storm approaching. A victim still looking toward the future. A man chasing attention at any cost. And a sequence of events that would soon become one of the most disturbing and unforgettable criminal cases Canada had ever seen. The city of Montreal often looks different depending on who is seeing it. To tourists, it is a place of old stone buildings, busy cafes, music drifting through summer streets, and a unique blend of European charm and North American energy. To students arriving from across the world, it is a city of opportunity, a place where futures are built one semester at a time. To police investigators, it is a city like any other, filled with thousands of stories unfolding simultaneously, most ordinary, some tragic, and a few so disturbing that they become permanently etched into the memory of everyone involved. In the spring of 2012, Montreal was preparing for another warm summer. Trees were turning green after a long Canadian winter. Sidewalks, filled with pedestrians, enjoying longer days. University campuses buzzed with students finishing assignments, making plans, and thinking about what came next in their lives. Among those students was a man named June Lin. Far from his birthplace in Wuhan, China, June had come to Canada chasing the same dream shared by countless international students. He wanted education. He wanted opportunity. He wanted a future built through hard work and determination. Friends described him as thoughtful and polite. He was not the loudest person in a room. He was not someone who demanded attention. Instead, he listened more than he spoke. He smiled easily. He carried himself with quiet confidence. Life in a foreign country was not always easy. There were cultural differences, language barriers, financial pressures, and the loneliness that sometimes accompanies living thousands of miles from family. But June adapted. He enrolled at Concordia University and worked toward his goals with the patience of someone who understood that meaningful achievements rarely happen overnight. His friends remembered simple things about him. The way he laughed during conversations, the way he spoke about technology and computers, the way he remained optimistic even when life became stressful. Like many young adults living alone, he occasionally used dating websites and social platforms to meet new people. There was nothing unusual about that. Millions of people did the same every day. It was simply another part of modern life. What nobody could have imagined was that one of those online interactions would eventually place him on a path toward unimaginable danger. At the same time that June Lin was building a future, another man was building something entirely different. His name was Luca Magnotta. Long before his name became known around the world, Luca had already spent years trying desperately to attract attention. He seemed obsessed with being noticed. Photographs of himself appeared everywhere online. Social media profiles multiplied. Stories about his life changed depending on the audience. Some people who knew him later described a man who appeared to be constantly performing, constantly crafting a version of himself that he wanted others to see. He worked as a model at times. He appeared in adult films. He pursued various opportunities connected to fame. Yet recognition never seemed enough. The attention arrived in small bursts before fading away again. For most people, that cycle would be frustrating. For Luca, it appeared almost unbearable. People who crossed paths with him often noticed how carefully he controlled his image. Photos were edited. Details were exaggerated. Reality seemed less important than perception. But beneath that pursuit of fame, darker signs were emerging. Years before June Lin entered his life, disturbing videos began appearing online. These videos featured animals, more specifically, cats. Viewers watched in horror as the animals were tortured and killed. The cruelty was deliberate, calculated. The videos were not hidden. They were uploaded to be seen, to be shared, to provoke reactions. Across the internet, communities of animal lovers and amateur investigators became determined to identify the person responsible. Many of them were ordinary people scattered across different countries. They had never met each other. Yet they spent countless hours examining video frames, studying backgrounds, analyzing reflections, and searching for clues. The mystery became an obsession. Who was the man in the videos? Why was he doing this? And perhaps most importantly, what would happen if he escalated further? Many participants feared the same thing. People capable of extreme cruelty toward animals sometimes move on to human victims. It was a possibility that haunted those following the case. Unfortunately, their fears would eventually prove justified. While internet investigators searched for answers, Luca continued moving through life. His online presence expanded. His fascination with attention deepened. And somewhere behind the carefully curated photographs and social media accounts, a dangerous fantasy appeared to be growing. One of the most unsettling aspects of the story is how ordinary the environment seemed around him. The apartment building where he lived in Montreal did not look sinister. The streets outside looked normal. Neighbors carried groceries. Students walked to class. Cars passed by. Life continued as it always had. Nothing about the building announced that it would soon become associated with one of the most infamous crimes in modern Canadian history. Inside that apartment, however, investigators would later discover evidence of a carefully documented nightmare. But in early 2012, nobody knew what was coming. The city remained unaware. June Lin remained unaware. Even many people who had followed the animal cruelty videos did not realize how close the situation was to becoming far worse. As spring turned toward summer, the contrast between the two men could not have been greater. June represented possibility. A student pursuing education. A son living far from home. A man trying to build a future. Luca represented performance. Image. Attention. A relentless desire to be noticed by the world. One life moved quietly forward. The other spiraled toward catastrophe. The digital age created the conditions that would eventually bring them together. For generations, people met through friends, workplaces, schools, or chance encounters. But modern technology had transformed human interaction. Conversations began through screens. Relationships formed through messages. Strangers connected instantly across cities and continents. Most of those interactions were harmless. Some led to friendships. Others led to romance. A few led to danger. In 2012, dating platforms and online advertisements offered countless opportunities to meet new people. Users often knew very little about the individuals on the other side of a profile picture. Trust became a leap of faith, a photograph, a short biography, a brief conversation, then a meeting. For millions of people, the process worked safely. For Jun Lin, it would become the doorway through which tragedy entered his life. Meanwhile, Luca's need for attention seemed to be intensifying. Recognition alone was no longer enough. The ordinary forms of fame he pursued had failed to satisfy him. The world had not given him the celebrity status he wanted. What happened next would suggest that he had begun searching for another path toward notoriety. A darker path. A path that guaranteed headlines, guaranteed attention, guaranteed that people everywhere would learn his name. Psychologists would later examine this aspect of the case closely. Many killers seek power. Some seek revenge. Others act from rage or greed. But Luca appeared driven by something different. He wanted an audience. The internet provided exactly that. Every upload could reach thousands. Every shocking image could spread globally within hours. Every disturbing act could generate discussion. Fear, curiosity, attention, the very things he seemed unable to live without. As the weeks passed, the distance between fantasy and reality grew smaller. Somewhere inside his apartment, plans were taking shape. The world outside remained unaware. Students attended classes. Workers commuted to jobs. Families gathered for dinners. Life continued normally. Yet hidden beneath that normalcy was a collision course between two strangers. One man seeking a future. One man seeking infamy. The tragedy that would soon unfold did not begin with a sudden burst of violence. It began with years of obsession. Years of attention-seeking behavior. Years of escalating warning signs. And perhaps the most chilling detail of all is that many of those warning signs were visible long before the murder itself. The animal cruelty videos, the fabricated online personas, the constant pursuit of notoriety, the disturbing need to shock others. Taken separately, they seemed alarming. Taken together, they formed a portrait that looked increasingly dangerous. Yet no one could predict exactly when that danger would erupt, or who would become the victim. As May 2012 approached, the stage was quietly being set. Montreal's streets remained busy. Concordia University's campus remained full of students planning their futures. Jun Lin continued living his life, unaware that he was nearing his final days. And Luca Magnotta continued feeding an obsession that seemed to grow stronger with every passing year. Soon, their paths would cross. Soon, a routine meeting between two strangers would begin one of the most horrifying criminal cases Canada had ever seen. And when the truth finally emerged, it would reveal not only a brutal murder, but a chilling glimpse into what can happen when a craving for fame becomes more important than human life itself. In the spring of 2012, Montreal was a city moving at its usual rhythm. Students hurried through university campuses carrying backpacks heavy with textbooks. Cafes spilled conversations onto sidewalks. Commuters stepped onto buses and trains without giving much thought to the strangers standing beside them. It was a city filled with thousands of ordinary stories unfolding every day. Among those stories was the life of a man named Jun Lin. To understand the tragedy that would soon shock the world, it is important to first understand who Jun Lin was before his name became attached to headlines, police reports, and courtroom testimony. Before he became a victim, he was simply a person trying to build a future. Jun Lin was born in Wuhan, China, in 1978. Like many young people growing up in a rapidly changing country, he dreamed of opportunities beyond what he could see around him. Friends and family would later describe him as intelligent, gentle, and thoughtful. He was not the loudest person in a room. He was not someone who constantly demanded attention. Instead, he listened carefully, smiled often, and treated people with kindness. As he grew older, Jun became fascinated by technology and computers. The digital world seemed filled with possibilities. It was a field that rewarded patience, curiosity, and problem-solving, qualities he naturally possessed. Eventually, he made the difficult decision that countless immigrants make every year. He left behind familiar streets, familiar faces, and the comfort of home in pursuit of something larger. Canada represented opportunity. For June, moving across the world was not simply a change of address. It was a leap into uncertainty. Every immigrant understands the challenge. New language, new customs, new social circles, new expectations. Everything that once felt automatic suddenly requires effort. Yet June embraced the challenge. He settled in Montreal, a city known for its cultural diversity and vibrant student population. There he enrolled at Concordia University to study computer engineering. The workload was demanding. Assignments piled up. Exams arrived one after another. Financial pressures were constant. Still, he remained committed. Classmates remembered him as hardworking and respectful. He was the kind of student who showed up prepared, the kind who stayed focused during group projects, the kind who preferred cooperation over conflict. Outside the classroom, however, life could be lonely. Montreal was full of people, yet loneliness often hides in crowded places. June was thousands of miles from his family. Time zone differences made communication difficult. Friendships formed slowly. Relationships required effort. Like many adults trying to create a social life in a modern city, he turned to online platforms. Dating websites and social networking applications had become increasingly popular by 2012. They offered opportunities to meet people who shared similar interests. For someone rebuilding his life in a foreign country, they seemed like useful tools. Friends later said June was trying to move forward after the end of a relationship. He was not searching for danger. He was not taking unusual risks. He was simply trying to connect with others. He enjoyed spending time with friends when he could. He appreciated good conversation. He liked exploring the city. He wanted what many people want: a stable future, meaningful relationships, and the chance to create a life that felt fulfilling. While June was working toward that future, another man was moving in a very different direction. Across Canada, a man named Luca Magnotta had spent years chasing attention. His story was not one of academic achievement or quiet perseverance. It was a story built around obsession. People who knew Magnotta often described him as someone who desperately wanted to be famous. Not respected, not admired for a specific accomplishment. Famous. The distinction mattered. Fame itself appeared to be the goal. Over the years, he created numerous online profiles. He posted photographs that were heavily edited. He exaggerated details about his life. He cultivated different identities depending on his audience. The internet gave him something he craved: visibility. In the early days of social media, attention could be measured instantly. Likes, comments, views, reactions. For many people, these numbers were harmless. For Magnotta, they seemed to become an obsession. He worked as a model at times. He appeared in adult films. He frequently reinvented himself online. Whenever attention faded, he searched for new ways to regain it. But attention obtained through ordinary means was never enough. People close to him noticed a pattern. He appeared fascinated by publicity. He monitored conversations about himself. He followed online discussions. He seemed intensely concerned with how others perceived him. As the years passed, his behavior became increasingly disturbing. Long before June Lin ever encountered him, internet users around the world had already begun noticing something deeply troubling. Videos began appearing online. The footage showed acts of cruelty toward animals. At first, many viewers hoped the videos were fake. They searched for signs of editing or special effects. They wanted to believe what they were seeing was not real. Unfortunately, it was. The videos depicted cats being tortured and killed. Viewers were horrified. Animal lovers across the internet became determined to identify the person responsible. Online communities formed around the investigation. Amateur researchers analyzed every frame. They examined furniture, electrical outlets, wall colors, and background objects. What began as outrage gradually transformed into an international effort to uncover the identity of the individual behind the videos. Again and again, the name Luca Magnotta surfaced. Yet proving it was difficult. Authorities struggled to act quickly because the evidence remained largely digital. Jurisdictional boundaries complicated investigations. The internet allowed individuals to hide behind layers of anonymity. Meanwhile, the videos continued generating exactly what Magnotta appeared to desire: attention. Thousands of people discussed him online. News outlets occasionally reported on the mystery. His name spread further. For many internet investigators, a terrifying fear began to emerge. They had seen this pattern before. Criminologists have long noted that individuals who commit extreme acts of violence against animals sometimes escalate toward violence against humans. The progression does not happen in every case, but the warning signs are well documented. Members of online communities repeatedly expressed concern. They feared that if the perpetrator was not stopped, a human victim might eventually follow. At the time, those fears seemed speculative. No one knew how quickly they would become reality. While these disturbing events unfolded online, Jun Lin continued living his life, largely unaware of the danger approaching him. His days revolved around studies, work, friendships, and future plans. He attended classes. He communicated with friends. He looked toward the future. Nothing suggested that his life was about to intersect with one of the most notorious killers in modern Canadian history. In retrospect, the contrast between the two men feels haunting. One was building a future. The other was constructing a fantasy built on notoriety. One sought connection. The other sought attention at any cost. One moved through life with kindness and optimism. The other increasingly drifted toward darkness. Yet in a city of millions, their paths eventually crossed. The mechanism that connected them was something incredibly ordinary. An online advertisement, a message, a conversation, a decision that seemed insignificant at the time. No flashing warning signs appeared. No alarm sounded. Nothing distinguished that interaction from countless others occurring every day across the internet. That is one of the most chilling aspects of this case. The beginning looked normal. There was no dramatic confrontation. No obvious threat. No visible danger. Just two strangers arranging to meet. By May 2012, Jun Lin could not have known that he was approaching the final chapter of his life. He could not know that investigators would one day reconstruct his last known movements frame by frame. He could not know that international headlines would carry his name. He could not know that his family would soon face unimaginable grief. And he certainly could not know that the man he was about to meet had spent years cultivating an obsession with visibility so powerful that it would ultimately drive him to commit an act of violence that shocked the entire world. The stage had been set long before either man entered the same room. Years of escalating behavior. Years of warning signs. Years of missed opportunities. As spring turned toward summer in Montreal, those separate stories were moving toward a collision point. Soon, security cameras would capture images that investigators would study endlessly. Soon, police officers would enter an apartment and discover evidence that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Soon, the world would learn the title of a video that would become infamous. And soon, a quiet student who had crossed an ocean in search of a better life would disappear, leaving behind questions, heartbreak, and a criminal case that would forever alter the way people viewed violence in the digital age. For now, however, Jun Lin was still alive. The city lights still reflected across Montreal streets at night. University buildings remained filled with students discussing assignments and future careers. Life continued normally. But beneath that ordinary surface, something terrible was already in motion. And neither Jun Lin nor the people who cared about him could yet see the darkness waiting just ahead. On the evening of May 24, 2012, Montreal seemed no different from any other late spring night. The city glowed beneath a sky that still held traces of daylight. Cars rolled through busy intersections. Restaurant patios were filled with conversations and laughter. Students gathered in apartments, cafes, and bars after long days of classes and work. For most people, it was just another ordinary evening. For Jun Lin, however, it would become the final night of his life. Somewhere in the city, he prepared to meet a man he barely knew. The meeting had likely begun the same way countless modern encounters begin, with messages exchanged online. Dating platforms had become part of everyday life. People met strangers for coffee, drinks, conversations, friendships, and relationships. Most interactions ended without incident. There was little reason to assume this one would be different. Yet behind the screen of the person arranging that meeting was someone whose life had been spiraling into increasingly disturbing territory for years. Luca Magnotta had spent much of his adult life chasing recognition. He wanted attention the way some people crave oxygen. Whether through modeling photographs, social media profiles, fabricated stories, or shocking online content, he constantly searched for ways to keep eyes focused on him. By 2012, his need for attention had evolved into something darker. The disturbing animal torture videos that had circulated online were already known among internet investigators. Communities dedicated to identifying the person responsible had spent years examining clues. Some believed Magnotta was merely seeking publicity. Others feared he represented something far more dangerous. That fear was about to become reality. Security cameras later captured footage showing June Lin entering the apartment building where Magnotta lived in Montreal. The images themselves appeared ordinary. No struggle, no signs of fear, no indication of the horror waiting behind the apartment door. June walked inside under his own power, likely expecting a private encounter between two adults. He never walked out again. What happened after that point was reconstructed through evidence gathered during the investigation, digital records, forensic analysis, and the horrifying video that would later emerge online. Inside the apartment, events unfolded beyond the view of any witnesses. The apartment itself was not remarkable from the outside. It was simply another residence in a city filled with thousands of residences. Neighbors had no reason to suspect that one of the most infamous crimes in Canadian history was about to occur within its walls. At some point during the encounter, June Lin lost control of the situation. Investigators would later determine that he was restrained. What followed was not a sudden act of rage. It was not a spontaneous confrontation. Evidence suggested planning. Evidence suggested preparation. Evidence suggested that the violence was not merely committed but documented. That distinction would become one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Many killers attempt to hide their crimes. Many seek secrecy. Many avoid leaving records behind. Magnotta appeared to do the opposite. A camera was present. Recording equipment was positioned. The events that unfolded were captured intentionally. Hours later, the world would learn the title attached to that recording. But on the night of May 24th, nobody outside that apartment knew what was happening. Friends of June Lin had no reason to worry. His family, separated by an ocean, could not know that their lives were already changing forever. The city continued moving through the night. Meanwhile, inside the apartment, violence escalated. The exact sequence of every moment remains known only through evidence and the actions documented later by investigators. What became clear was that June Lin suffered a brutal attack that ultimately resulted in his death. The assault was not brief. It was not impulsive. It reflected a level of cruelty that shocked even experienced investigators. One of the most chilling details would emerge later during the trial. Prosecutors argued that the crime demonstrated planning and control rather than temporary loss of emotional restraint. This mattered enormously because it suggested that the murder was not simply about violence. It was about spectacle, the desire to create something that would attract attention, something that would spread, something that would be discussed, something that would make the perpetrator impossible to ignore. As the hours passed, June Lin's life came to an end inside that apartment. The dreams he had carried from China to Canada ended there as well. The future he had been building disappeared. The friendships he had nurtured, the career he had pursued, the family who loved him. Everything stopped. Yet the crime itself was not over. For many murder investigations, the death marks the central event. In this case, it was only the beginning. After the killing, Magnotta began a series of actions that transformed a homicide into an international nightmare. Investigators later discovered evidence indicating that he remained remarkably calm. Instead of panicking, he appeared focused, methodical, deliberate. The apartment became a crime scene unlike anything most investigators had ever encountered. Physical evidence suggested extensive efforts to manipulate the body after death. The actions were horrifying enough that many media organizations later chose to avoid describing them in full detail. Even veteran law enforcement officers struggled with the brutality revealed during the investigation. Yet perhaps the most disturbing element remained the camera, because the recording did not stay inside the apartment. The following day, May 25, 2012, a video appeared online. Its title immediately attracted attention. One Lunatic One Ice Pick. The name itself seemed designed to provoke curiosity and shock. At first, many viewers assumed it was fake. The internet had long been filled with hoaxes, staged videos, and fabricated content intended to generate reactions. Some people clicked expecting special effects. Others expected dark humor. Many expected nothing more than another disturbing internet prank. What they saw instead left them horrified. The footage appeared to document an actual killing. Online viewers reacted with disbelief. Forums exploded with discussions. People argued over authenticity. Some insisted it had to be staged. Others felt sick as they watched. The possibility that it might be real terrified everyone. Within hours, copies began spreading. Attempts to remove the video struggled against the speed of internet distribution. Once uploaded, content could be downloaded, mirrored, reposted, and shared across countless platforms. Authorities became aware of the footage. Investigators began examining whether an actual crime had occurred. At that moment, however, they still lacked a confirmed victim. June Lin had not yet been publicly identified. His disappearance was not yet connected to a murder investigation. The horrifying puzzle pieces had not fully assembled. Meanwhile, Magnotta appeared to be pursuing exactly what he had always pursued. Attention! The video generated international discussion. People shared screenshots. News organizations received tips. Online communities immediately recognized similarities to the earlier animal cruelty videos. Many of the same internet investigators who had tracked the cat videos for years suddenly found themselves confronting a terrifying realization. Their worst fears had come true. The person they believed responsible for animal torture had escalated to killing a human being. The progression they had warned about for years had become reality. For them, the news carried a unique horror. It was not merely shocking. It felt preventable. Some wondered whether earlier intervention might have changed the outcome. Others struggled with guilt despite having done everything possible to alert authorities. Across the internet, conversations intensified. Who was the victim? Who was the killer? Was the video genuine? Where had it been filmed? Could the suspect be identified? As investigators began examining evidence, another troubling detail emerged. Magnotta did not appear interested in hiding. In fact, many of his actions seemed almost designed to ensure discovery. The apartment itself contained clues. Digital evidence existed. The video had been distributed publicly. This was not the behavior of someone desperately trying to erase all traces of a crime. It was the behavior of someone who wanted an audience, someone who wanted the world watching. That desire for attention would ultimately become one of the defining themes of the entire case. Unlike many murderers who seek power, revenge, or financial gain, Magnotta appeared driven by something different. Recognition, visibility, notoriety. The crime itself seemed inseparable from the publicity surrounding it. As investigators worked to identify both victim and suspect, events were already moving beyond Montreal. The case was about to expand internationally. News organizations began receiving reports. Online communities intensified their investigations. Law enforcement agencies coordinated efforts. And somewhere amid all that chaos, Luca Magnotta was preparing to leave Canada. The murder of June Lin had already shocked those who knew about it, but the discoveries still ahead would push the case into territory almost impossible to comprehend. Because the apartment held more secrets, the city had not yet seen the horrifying packages that would soon appear. Investigators had not yet uncovered the full extent of the post-mortem actions. The international manhunt had not yet begun. And the world still did not realize that one of the most disturbing criminal investigations of the internet era was only beginning. The final hours of June Lin's life had unfolded behind a closed apartment door. What happened next would unfold before the eyes of the entire world. By the morning of May 29, 2012, the investigation had already begun moving in multiple directions. Authorities were examining the disturbing video that had surfaced online. Missing person concerns surrounding June Lin were growing. Digital investigators across the internet were exchanging theories and screenshots. Yet despite all the attention, law enforcement still lacked one critical element that every homicide investigation needs: a confirmed crime scene that could tell the story of what had actually happened. That changed behind an apartment building in Montreal. The discovery began in a place so ordinary that most residents would have walked past it without a second glance. Behind the building sat an area used for garbage disposal, a space where dumpsters and discarded items blended into the background of city life. It was not the kind of place people studied closely. It was simply part of the landscape. A maintenance worker moving through the area noticed something unusual. A suitcase. At first glance, it appeared abandoned. That was hardly rare in a city. People discarded furniture, clothing, broken appliances, and luggage all the time. The worker might easily have ignored it and continued with his day. But something felt wrong. The odor surrounding the suitcase was difficult to ignore. Even before it was opened, the smell carried a message. Anyone who has worked around decomposition recognizes it immediately. It is heavy, distinct, unforgettable. The worker contacted authorities. Soon police officers arrived. What began as a suspicious item call rapidly transformed into something far more serious. Investigators approached cautiously. The odor grew stronger. The atmosphere around the scene changed. Experienced officers sensed they were about to encounter something terrible. When the suitcase was examined, their fears were confirmed. Inside was a human torso. The discovery immediately elevated the investigation to an entirely different level. Police now had physical evidence confirming that a homicide had occurred. The scene became active with investigators, forensic technicians, photographers, and crime scene specialists. Yellow tape stretched across sections of the area. Officers began documenting everything. Every angle, every measurement, every item nearby. Nothing could be overlooked. The victim's remains were carefully recovered. Nearby, investigators found additional evidence. Clothing, bloodstained materials, various items that appeared connected to the crime. Each discovery created new questions. Who was the victim? Where had the murder occurred? Who had transported the remains to this location? And perhaps most importantly, where was the killer? As forensic teams processed the area, another crucial lead emerged. The suitcase had not appeared there by magic. Someone had carried it. Someone had moved it from another location. Someone had risked being seen. That meant there was a chance surveillance cameras had captured something. Montreal, like most major cities, possessed numerous security systems. Apartment buildings, businesses, street cameras, parking areas, entrances and exits. Investigators immediately began searching for footage. The apartment building itself soon became a major focus. Detectives started reviewing recordings from security cameras installed around the property. Hours of footage had to be examined carefully. The process was tedious. Every minute mattered. Every frame might contain a clue. Eventually, investigators observed exactly what they had hoped and feared to find. The cameras showed Luca Magnotta. The footage captured him moving through the property, carrying garbage bags and other items shortly after the suspected time of the murder. The images were chilling, not because they showed violence directly, but because of how ordinary he appeared. There was no visible panic, no frantic behavior, no obvious signs of someone overwhelmed by guilt or fear. Instead, the footage suggested purpose, movement, planning, a man completing tasks. Investigators began building a timeline. Step by step, minute by minute, the apartment emerged as the likely primary crime scene. The garbage area became a disposal site. The surveillance footage became a visual record connecting the suspect to crucial evidence. As the investigation progressed, officers obtained access to Magnotta's apartment. What they found inside was deeply disturbing. Crime scenes often reveal emotional stories, arguments frozen in time, struggles captured through overturned furniture, moments of violence reflected in blood patterns. This apartment told a particularly horrifying story. Evidence suggested that extensive violent activity had occurred within its walls. Forensic teams worked methodically. Photographs documented every room. Samples were collected. Surfaces were tested. Potential DNA evidence was preserved. Nothing was left to chance. The apartment contained signs that aligned with the video circulating online. That connection strengthened investigators' confidence that they were looking at the location where June Lin had died. The atmosphere inside the residence reportedly affected even experienced investigators. Police officers encounter tragedy regularly. Many spend careers processing violent crime scenes. Yet certain locations remain unforgettable. Certain scenes stay with investigators long after cases end. This apartment became one of those places. The combination of physical evidence and the video's existence created an especially disturbing picture. Every room seemed connected to a larger narrative of planning, recording, and violence. Outside the building, media attention intensified. News crews began gathering. Reporters competed for updates. The story was spreading internationally. Public fascination grew with every new development. At the same time, investigators still faced significant challenges. The victim had not yet been formally identified through all necessary forensic procedures. Although evidence increasingly pointed toward June Lin, authorities needed scientific confirmation. Forensic experts began comparing available information. DNA testing became crucial. Investigators worked carefully to ensure accuracy. Families deserved certainty. Courts demanded certainty. The investigation could not rely on assumptions. As laboratory work continued, detectives expanded their search for additional remains. The torso recovered from the suitcase represented only part of the victim. That reality created an urgent and deeply unsettling task. Other body parts remained missing. Authorities feared they might have been discarded elsewhere. Search efforts intensified. Investigators examined garbage routes, waste processing facilities, transportation records, potential disposal locations. Every possibility had to be explored. Meanwhile, a shocking new development emerged. Packages began appearing through Canada's postal system. At first, postal workers and office employees had no reason to suspect anything unusual. Mail arrives every day. Boxes and envelopes move constantly through the system. Most contain ordinary items, documents, gifts, business materials. Nothing prepares someone for discovering human remains. One package contained a severed human foot. Another contained a severed hand. Recipients included political offices. The discovery sent shockwaves across the country. The realization that body parts were being mailed transformed public concern into national alarm. Suddenly, this was no longer simply a homicide investigation. It had become a case involving the deliberate distribution of human remains across Canada. Fear spread rapidly. People wondered whether additional packages existed. Postal employees became increasingly cautious. Law enforcement agencies coordinated efforts across multiple jurisdictions. Every new discovery deepened the horror. DNA testing eventually confirmed investigators' fears. The remains belonged to the same victim. June Lin, the young student who had come to Canada seeking opportunity and education, had been subjected to unimaginable violence. For those who knew him, the confirmation was devastating. Friends who had hoped for another explanation found themselves facing reality. Family members thousands of miles away confronted grief that few people can comprehend. The person they loved was gone, and the circumstances surrounding his death had become international news. Back in Montreal, detectives continued processing evidence. Every item recovered from the apartment added detail to the timeline. Electronic devices became particularly important. Computers, storage media, digital records. The modern world leaves trails, messages, search histories, videos, location data. Investigators knew those trails might reveal motive, planning, and intent. Digital forensic specialists began examining recovered devices. The work required patience. Information had to be extracted carefully, preserved correctly, analyzed thoroughly. The goal was not merely to prove a crime occurred. The goal was to understand exactly how it happened. As evidence accumulated, one conclusion became increasingly clear. This murder had not been hidden. Many criminals attempt to erase traces of their actions. Magnotta appeared to have embraced visibility. The video, the mailed remains, the online activity, the evidence suggested someone who wanted the crime noticed, someone who wanted discussion, someone who wanted attention. For investigators, that realization carried important implications. A suspect motivated by notoriety behaves differently than a suspect motivated solely by fear or greed. Such individuals often leave trails. They seek audiences. They monitor reactions. They crave recognition. Understanding that psychology would become critical as the case evolved. Because one major problem remained unresolved. Luca Magnotta was gone. By the time investigators pieced together the evidence connecting him to the apartment and the remains, he had already left the scene. His whereabouts were unknown. Authorities knew who they were looking for. They knew what he looked like. They had surveillance footage. They had physical evidence. They had growing international media attention. But they did not have a suspect. The discovery behind the Montreal apartment building had transformed the investigation. What began as disturbing online content was now a confirmed homicide supported by forensic evidence. The crime scene had spoken. The victim had been identified. The evidence pointed toward a suspect. Yet as detectives reviewed reports late into the night, one unsettling reality remained. Somewhere beyond Montreal, Luca Magnotta was still free, and the search for him was about to become one of the most widely publicized international manhunts in modern Canadian history. As May 2012 drew to a close, investigators in Montreal found themselves racing against time. The discovery of June Lin's remains, the horrifying video circulating online, and the growing mountain of evidence connected to Luca Magnotta had transformed the case into an international emergency. Every passing hour increased the distance between the suspect and the authorities pursuing him. Yet in many ways, the investigation had begun long before police officially identified him as a murderer. Months and even years before June Lin entered Magnotta's apartment, strangers scattered across the internet had already become concerned about him. It was an unusual beginning to a murder investigation. Most homicide cases start with a victim. This one, in a strange way, began with cats. Long before police agencies knew his name, disturbing videos had appeared online showing kittens being tortured and killed. The clips spread rapidly through animal rights communities and internet forums. Viewers were horrified not only by the cruelty itself, but by the way the videos seemed carefully designed to attract attention. Many people watched briefly before turning away. Others became obsessed. A small group of internet users decided they would identify the person responsible. They were not police officers. They were not detectives. They were ordinary people living in different countries, connected only through computers and a shared determination to find the individual behind the videos. Night after night, they analyzed every frame. Furniture, electrical outlets, background reflections, cigarette packages, wall decorations, anything that might reveal a location, anything that might reveal an identity. The process resembled amateur intelligence work. One clue led to another. The group eventually became convinced that the person appearing in connection with the videos was Luca Magnotta. Yet when they attempted to alert authorities, their warnings often failed to generate urgency. At the time, the case involved animal cruelty, not murder. Many feared that the individual responsible might someday escalate to violence against humans. The concern seemed dramatic then. Months later, it would appear prophetic. By the time June Lin disappeared, those online investigators were already familiar with Magnotta's behavior patterns. They knew about his obsession with attention, his constant reinvention of his public image, his endless attempts to become famous. Many remember something else as well. He appeared to enjoy being hunted. He seemed fascinated by the idea of people searching for him. That realization would become increasingly important as authorities launched a global manhunt. Back in Montreal, police investigators were assembling the timeline surrounding June Lin's final days. Security footage established that June Lin had entered Magnotta's apartment on May 24, 2012. He never emerged. Cell phone records, surveillance footage, forensic evidence, and witness statements began filling gaps in the narrative. Each piece of information strengthened the same conclusion. June Lin had been killed inside the apartment. The evidence supporting that conclusion continued growing. Blood evidence recovered from the residence linked the location directly to the crime. DNA evidence connected June Lin to the apartment and to the remains that had been discovered. Investigators carefully documented every finding. Because of the extreme publicity surrounding the case, they understood that every detail would eventually face scrutiny in court. Nothing could be left to assumption. Everything had to be supported by evidence. As forensic teams worked in Montreal, another group of investigators focused on a different challenge: finding Luca Magnotta. Initially, authorities believed he might still be somewhere in Canada. Airports were notified. Border crossings received alerts. Police agencies throughout the country shared information. But evidence soon suggested something troubling. Magnotta had likely already left the country. Detectives began reviewing travel records, financial transactions, immigration databases, passenger manifests. The modern world creates digital footprints almost everywhere. Even fugitives leave traces. Investigators soon discovered that Magnotta had boarded a flight shortly after the murder. The discovery changed everything. The search was no longer national. It was international. Authorities requested assistance from foreign law enforcement agencies. Information flowed between countries. Canadian investigators coordinated with partners overseas. The case was now attracting enormous media attention. News broadcasts aired Magnotta's photograph repeatedly. His face appeared on television screens across multiple continents. Newspapers published front-page stories. Online articles generated millions of views. Ironically, the publicity he had always seemed to crave was finally arriving. But now it came attached to accusations of murder. As the search widened, investigators began examining Magnotta's past more closely. The deeper they looked, the stranger the picture became. His life appeared filled with contradictions. He frequently exaggerated accomplishments. He claimed connections to celebrities. He portrayed himself differently, depending on the audience. Online, he often seemed to be performing a version of himself rather than revealing his actual personality. Former acquaintances described someone intensely focused on image, someone who measured value through attention, someone who became frustrated when recognition failed to arrive. Investigators studying his history noticed recurring patterns: false identities, fabricated stories, attempts to generate publicity. The behavior suggested a person who viewed life almost as a stage production. That perspective seemed especially relevant given the way the murder had unfolded. The crime itself appeared designed for an audience. The video, the packages, the online dissemination. Each act seemed intended not merely to kill, but to create spectacle. Meanwhile, authorities received assistance from an unexpected source. The same online communities that had investigated the cat videos years earlier began sharing information again. Although police relied primarily on official evidence, the online researchers possessed a detailed understanding of Magnotta's habits. Some had spent years tracking his internet activity. They recognized usernames, patterns, aliases, connections between accounts. In certain cases, information gathered by these amateur investigators proved remarkably useful. The collaboration between traditional law enforcement and internet communities became one of the most unusual aspects of the case. It demonstrated how criminal investigations were changing in the digital age. A suspect could no longer disappear easily into anonymity. Every online post, every photograph, every interaction created potential evidence. As authorities traced Magnotta's movements, a picture emerged. After leaving Canada, he traveled to France. Rather than hiding completely, he appeared to move openly through various locations: hotels, transportation hubs, public areas. Investigators found this behavior surprising. Most fugitives attempt to minimize visibility. Magnotta seemed unable to resist attention. Reports later suggested he followed media coverage of the case. He knew the world was searching for him. He knew his face dominated news broadcasts. Yet instead of retreating into isolation, he appeared fascinated by the unfolding drama. For investigators, this characteristic offered both opportunities and challenges. A suspect who seeks attention may expose himself, but such a suspect can also behave unpredictably. Every decision required careful analysis. Would he continue moving? Would he attempt another disguise? Would he surrender? Or would he escalate further? Nobody knew. As the days passed, pressure intensified. The case had become one of the most visible criminal investigations in the world. Political leaders demanded results. Media organizations pursued constant updates. The victim's family awaited justice. Police agencies faced enormous expectations. Yet despite growing evidence, one essential element remained missing: the suspect himself. Then came a breakthrough. International alerts distributed through law enforcement channels generated new leads. One of the most important tools was an Interpol Red Notice. The notice effectively informed police agencies around the world that Magnotta was wanted for serious crimes. His photograph circulated globally. Customs officers saw it. Airport personnel saw it. Border agents saw it. Hotel workers saw it. Ordinary citizens saw it. Millions of eyes suddenly became part of the search effort. Investigators understood that publicity could become their greatest advantage. The more recognizable Magnotta became, the harder it would be for him to move unnoticed. Every news report increased the likelihood that someone would identify him. Meanwhile, forensic teams continued strengthening the case against him. Evidence recovered from the apartment was analyzed exhaustively. DNA testing confirmed critical connections. Video evidence underwent examination. Digital files were cataloged. Investigators wanted a prosecution capable of surviving every legal challenge. The goal was not simply arrest. The goal was conviction. As June began, law enforcement agencies across multiple countries remained engaged in the search. Tips arrived constantly. Some proved useful. Many did not. Every lead required evaluation. Every reported sighting demanded attention. The workload was enormous, yet investigators refused to slow down. The memory of June Lin remained at the center of every decision. Friends described him as kind, intelligent, and hopeful. A man pursuing education and opportunity. A man whose future had been stolen. Those descriptions reinforced investigators' determination. This was not merely an international media story. It was a homicide investigation. A real victim. A real family. Real grief. Late-night meetings continued. Evidence boards filled with photographs and timelines. Investigators reviewed reports repeatedly. Every movement of the suspect was mapped. Every known contact was examined. Every possibility was considered. Gradually, the search area narrowed. Authorities became increasingly confident that Magnotta remained somewhere in Europe. The challenge was locating him before he moved again. The entire world seemed to be watching. And somewhere across the Atlantic, the man at the center of the investigation was still free, still moving, and still following the headlines that had finally made him famous. The breakthrough everyone was waiting for was now approaching. And it would arrive in a place no one could have predicted. For nearly 2 weeks, Luca Magnotta had managed to stay one step ahead of investigators. His face was on television screens around the world. His name dominated newspaper headlines. Law enforcement agencies across multiple continents were searching for him. Interpol had issued an international notice. Airports, train stations, border crossings, and hotels had been alerted. Yet somehow he remained free. Every morning seemed to begin with the same question. Where is Luca Magnotta? Behind the scenes, investigators in Canada worked around the clock. Every tip that arrived had to be checked. Every reported sighting demanded attention. Some leads pointed to France. Others suggested he had moved into Eastern Europe. A few were obvious mistakes. People frequently mistook strangers for the most wanted man in the world. The volume of information became overwhelming. But among the thousands of tips, police believed a pattern was beginning to emerge. Magnotta appeared unable to completely disappear. Unlike many fugitives who cut themselves off from society, he seemed drawn toward public spaces, toward attention, toward visibility, toward the very thing that had defined much of his life. Investigators studying his background had already reached a troubling conclusion. Magnotta's obsession was not simply violence. It was recognition. For years, he had tried to manufacture fame. He had created countless online profiles. He had promoted himself relentlessly. He had carefully edited photographs to present an idealized image of himself. He had spread stories about his life that were exaggerated or entirely fabricated. Attention had become a kind of addiction. Now, after the murder of June Lin, he had achieved a level of notoriety beyond anything he had ever imagined. The irony was impossible to ignore. The thing he had spent years chasing might ultimately become the reason he was caught. As investigators reconstructed his movements, they discovered that after leaving Montreal, Magnotta had traveled through Paris. Security footage, travel records, and witness statements gradually filled in gaps. He had not vanished into remote countryside. He had not hidden in isolated safe houses. Instead, he had moved through busy urban environments. The behavior puzzled some investigators. Others were less surprised. A person obsessed with image often struggles with anonymity. And Magnotta appeared fascinated by the media storm surrounding him. Reports later suggested that he followed news coverage of the case. He knew exactly how much attention he was receiving. The world was watching him. And for someone like Magnotta, that attention may have been impossible to resist. Meanwhile, the investigation itself had become a global operation. Canadian authorities coordinated closely with international partners. Information flowed between agencies at an extraordinary pace. Every new clue was shared immediately. Every confirmed sighting triggered urgent communication. Detectives understood that capturing Magnotta would require cooperation across borders. No single agency could solve the case alone. As June 2012 began, pressure mounted. The public wanted answers. June Lin's family wanted justice. Police wanted an arrest. And journalists everywhere wanted updates. Then, on June 4th, everything changed. That morning in Berlin, Germany, life seemed ordinary. People moved through train stations. Workers commuted to their jobs. Tourists walked crowded streets. The city carried on with its usual rhythm. Among those moving through Berlin was Luca Magnotta. Despite being one of the most wanted fugitives in the world, he was not hiding underground. He was not disguised beyond recognition. He was simply moving through public spaces. Eventually, he entered an internet cafe in the Neukölln district. Inside, rows of computer terminals glowed softly. Customers sat quietly browsing websites, checking emails and reading news. Nothing appeared unusual, at least not initially. Magnotta selected a computer and sat down. Then he began doing something astonishing. He searched for news stories about himself. The man being hunted across the globe was reading reports about the hunt. Investigators would later marvel at the recklessness of the decision. But perhaps it was not recklessness. Perhaps it was compulsion. For years, Magnotta had chased attention. Now he was consuming it. Article after article described the investigation. Photographs showed his face. Stories detailed the allegations against him. The world's spotlight had finally found him. And he could not look away. At some point, another customer recognized him. Accounts differ slightly regarding exactly who first became suspicious, but what remains clear is that someone connected the face sitting at a computer terminal with the face appearing in international news reports. The resemblance was unmistakable. The customer alerted employees. Concerns spread quickly. Police were contacted. Within a short time, officers arrived at the internet cafe. For investigators thousands of miles away, events were suddenly moving very fast. Inside the cafe, officers approached the suspect. Magnotta attempted to remain calm. When questioned, he reportedly provided false information about his identity. But by then, it was already too late. Authorities had prepared extensively for this possibility. Fingerprints would provide certainty. Documents would be checked. Every procedure would be followed carefully. The man sitting before them could deny who he was. The evidence could not. The fingerprint comparison confirmed the truth. Luca Magnotta had been found. The international manhunt was over. News of the arrest spread around the world within hours. Television networks interrupted programming. Breaking news banners appeared on screens. Online publications updated their headlines. After days of uncertainty, authorities finally had their suspect in custody. For investigators in Canada, the moment brought enormous relief. Months of evidence collection. Days of non-stop pursuit, international coordination, countless hours of work. All of it had led to this moment, yet celebration remained limited, because behind every headline stood the reason the investigation had begun. June Lin. The arrest did not erase what had happened. It did not restore a life. It did not lessen the grief experienced by family and friends. What it did provide was the possibility of justice. As German authorities processed the arrest, preparations began for extradition proceedings. Magnotta would need to be returned to Canada to face charges. Legal procedures required careful handling. The case had attracted extraordinary public attention. Any mistake could create complications later. Officials therefore moved deliberately. Every document was reviewed. Every requirement was satisfied. Meanwhile, investigators continued strengthening the prosecution's case. The arrest was only one milestone. A conviction would require overwhelming evidence. Fortunately, evidence was exactly what investigators possessed. The volume of material connecting Magnotta to the crime was immense. Surveillance footage, travel records, DNA evidence, physical evidence recovered from the apartment, postal evidence linked to the packages, digital evidence connected to the video. Each category reinforced the others. The case resembled a puzzle whose pieces all pointed toward the same conclusion. Prosecutors understood the significance of that fact. Defense attorneys could challenge individual elements, but challenging all of them simultaneously would be far more difficult. The evidence formed a cohesive narrative, one supported by science, documentation, and eyewitness testimony. As extradition arrangements progressed, public fascination with the case continued growing. Many people struggled to comprehend the crime itself. Others became fascinated by the investigation. Particular attention focused on the internet communities that had tracked Magnotta years earlier after the animal cruelty videos. For those online investigators, the arrest carried special significance. Some had spent years warning that the individual behind those videos posed a serious danger. Many had feared escalation. Now their fears appeared tragically justified. The progression from animal cruelty to homicide became a major topic of discussion among criminologists and behavioral experts. For decades, researchers had examined connections between violence toward animals and later violence toward humans. The Magnotta case seemed to provide one of the most disturbing modern examples. Investigators reviewing his history recognized numerous warning signs. The need for attention, the pattern of escalation, the carefully staged nature of the crimes, the desire to shock audiences. None of these elements alone predicted murder. Together, however, they painted a troubling picture. Back in Montreal, members of June Lin's community reacted to news of the arrest with mixed emotions. Relief, sadness, anger, exhaustion. The case had generated international headlines, but for those who knew June Lin personally, the attention often felt secondary. They remembered a friend, a classmate, a son, a person who had traveled across the world seeking opportunity, someone who should have been planning his future rather than becoming the subject of a homicide investigation. Many attended vigils. Flowers accumulated at memorial sites. Candles flickered in quiet gatherings. Photographs of June Lin appeared alongside messages of remembrance. While the media focused on the suspect, those closest to the victim worked to preserve memories of the man whose life had been taken. As summer advanced, legal proceedings moved forward. Magnotta would eventually stand trial in Canada. The evidence would be presented publicly. Witnesses would testify. Experts would explain forensic findings. The justice system would begin the difficult task of transforming horror into legal facts. But before any of that could happen, one crucial chapter had already ended. The search was over. The fugitive who had crossed oceans, the man whose image had appeared on screens around the world, the suspect who had spent years craving fame, had finally been found sitting quietly in front of a computer screen, reading stories about himself. And in that moment, the obsession that had driven so much of his life became the very thing that led authorities directly to him. The breakthrough investigators had been waiting for had arrived. Now the battle would move from international streets and border crossings into a courtroom where evidence, not headlines, would determine Luca Magnotta's fate. By the time Luca Magnotta's trial began in the autumn of 2014, more than 2 years had passed since the murder of June Lin. The headlines had never completely disappeared. The images, the international manhunt, the disturbing video, and the horrifying details of the crime had ensured that the case remained etched into public memory. Yet inside the courtroom in Montreal, the focus was no longer on speculation, internet discussions, or media coverage. It was now about evidence, responsibility, and the legal process that would determine Magnotta's future. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered before sunrise. Television crews positioned cameras along sidewalks. Journalists from Canada, Europe, Asia, and the United States waited for updates. Every day brought renewed attention. Every witness generated headlines. Every piece of evidence became a subject of discussion. For many observers, it felt less like a criminal trial and more like the conclusion of a story the entire world had been following for years. But for June Lin's family, there was nothing dramatic or entertaining about the proceedings. Every day in court meant revisiting the worst moment of their lives. Every testimony forced them to hear details they wished had never existed. Every photograph carried unbearable weight. The courtroom became a place where grief and justice collided. When proceedings began, prosecutors presented a straightforward argument. The evidence, they claimed, overwhelmingly demonstrated that Luca Magnotta had planned, committed, documented, and attempted to conceal the murder of June Lin. Their case relied not on a single piece of evidence, but on an enormous collection of interconnected facts. Surveillance footage, DNA evidence, digital records, witness testimony, travel documentation, postal evidence, forensic examinations. Together, these elements formed a powerful narrative. Investigators described how June Lin had entered Magnotta's apartment on May 24, 2012. Security cameras recorded the moment. There was no mystery regarding where June Lin had gone. The footage showed him entering the building. No footage showed him leaving. That fact alone became one of the most significant foundations of the prosecution's case. Witnesses then described the investigation that followed June Lin's disappearance. Police officers explained how evidence recovered from the apartment connected directly to the victim. Forensic specialists carefully walked jurors through scientific findings. Blood evidence recovered from the scene matched June Lin. DNA evidence linked the apartment to the remains that had been discovered. Each expert testimony added another layer of certainty. The scientific evidence spoke with a clarity that speculation could never achieve. Prosecutors then turned to one of the most disturbing aspects of the case: the video. Although the court took precautions regarding how evidence was presented, the existence of the recording became central to understanding the crime. Investigators explained how digital evidence connected the recording directly to Magnotta. Metadata, computer records, internet activity, all pointed toward the same conclusion. The video was not an anonymous creation. It was tied to the accused. Jurors listened carefully. Some members of the public struggled to comprehend how a person could document such violence. Yet prosecutors argued that the recording revealed something important: planning, control, awareness. The crime had not occurred in a moment of confusion or accident. According to the prosecution, it reflected deliberate choices. The packages mailed to political offices and educational institutions also became critical evidence. Postal inspectors described the discovery of human remains. Investigators detailed how DNA testing confirmed that the body parts belonged to June Lin. Records connect to the shipments to actions taken after the murder. These details strengthen the argument that Magnotta had attempted not merely to kill, but also to create widespread attention and fear. Every new witness seemed to reinforce the same conclusion. The evidence pointed consistently toward one person: Luca Magnotta. Yet despite the overwhelming evidence, the trial was not simply about whether the accused had committed the acts in question. The defense pursued a different strategy. Rather than denying that Magnotta had been involved, defense attorneys focused on his mental state. They argued that severe mental illness had affected his ability to understand reality. The defense presented psychiatric evidence suggesting that Magnotta suffered from significant psychological disorders. Experts discussed diagnoses, behavioral patterns, delusions, symptoms observed over many years. The defense argued that the murder occurred within the context of serious mental illness. Their goal was not necessarily to dispute the physical evidence. That would have been extraordinarily difficult. Instead, they sought to convince jurors that Magnotta's mental condition reduced or eliminated criminal responsibility. The courtroom became a battleground between competing interpretations. One side emphasized planning, preparation, and deliberate behavior. The other emphasized psychological disturbance. Jurors faced the difficult task of evaluating both. Psychiatric testimony often introduced complex questions. Can someone be mentally ill and still understand their actions? Can planning coexist with severe psychological disorders? How should the law evaluate responsibility when mental illness is involved? These questions have challenged courts for generations. In the Magnotta case, they became central to the defense. Prosecutors responded aggressively. They argued that numerous actions demonstrated awareness and intent. The efforts to conceal evidence, the disposal of remains, the international flight, the use of aliases, the attempts to avoid detection. Each action suggested an understanding that a serious crime had been committed. Prosecutors contended that these behaviors were inconsistent with an individual incapable of appreciating reality. The debate continued for weeks. Witness after witness entered the courtroom. Investigators described the search for Magnotta. International officials explained the extradition process. Forensic experts reviewed evidence in extraordinary detail. Psychiatrists offered competing opinions. The trial became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in modern Canadian history. Throughout the process, attention frequently returned to June Lin. Friends and acquaintances described the man behind the headlines. They spoke about his kindness, his intelligence, his ambitions, his willingness to embrace a new life in Canada. The testimony reminded everyone that the case was not merely about a defendant. It was about a victim whose future had been stolen. June Lin's family endured the proceedings with remarkable strength. For them, each day represented another painful step toward answers. Nothing said in court could restore what had been lost. But the trial offered an opportunity for truth to be formally established. As closing arguments approached, tension filled the courtroom. The prosecution summarized months of evidence. Piece by piece, they reconstructed the crime. They reminded jurors of surveillance footage, DNA results, digital records, travel history, the video, the mailed packages, the efforts to flee. According to prosecutors, the evidence painted a clear and undeniable picture. The defense delivered its own final argument. Attorneys urged jurors to consider the psychiatric evidence carefully. They emphasized mental illness. They argued that the case involved more than simple criminal intent. They asked jurors to examine not only what happened but why it happened. The responsibility now rested with the jury. After hearing weeks of testimony and reviewing extensive evidence, jurors withdrew to deliberate. Outside the courtroom, journalists waited anxiously. News organizations prepared special coverage. Families waited. Investigators waited. The entire country seemed to pause. When the verdict finally arrived in December 2014, the courtroom filled quickly. Observers sensed the significance of the moment. Years of investigation, months of preparation, weeks of testimony. Everything had led here. One by one, the verdicts were read. Guilty, guilty, guilty. The jury found Luca Magnotta guilty of first-degree murder. He was also convicted on additional charges related to the abuse of a corpse, publishing obscene material, and mailing human remains. The verdict brought a sense of finality to a case that had shocked the world. For prosecutors, it represented validation of years of work. For investigators, it confirmed the conclusions they had reached during the earliest stages of the investigation. For June Lin's loved ones, it offered a measure of justice. Not peace, not healing, but justice. Following the verdict, the court imposed a life sentence. Under Canadian law, Magnotta would not be eligible to apply for parole for 25 years. The sentence reflected the severity of the crime and the jury's conclusion that the murder had been intentional and planned. As proceedings ended, many observers reflected on the extraordinary nature of the case. It contained elements rarely seen together in a single investigation. A murder documented on video, body parts sent through the mail, an international manhunt, worldwide media attention, internet communities that helped track clues, a fugitive captured while reading news about himself. Yet beneath those extraordinary details remained a simple truth. A human being had lost his life. A family had lost a son. Friends had lost someone they cared about. No verdict could change that reality. The courtroom had delivered its judgment. The legal battle was over. But the deeper questions raised by the case, the nature of obsession, the pursuit of fame, the warning signs that had appeared years earlier, and the lasting impact on everyone involved, would continue long after the trial ended. Those questions would become part of the final chapter of the story. When the courtroom doors finally closed and the cameras began to disappear, many people assumed the story of Luca Magnotta had reached its end. The verdict had been delivered. The sentence had been imposed. The international manhunt was over. The evidence had been examined. The legal process had spoken. For the public, the case slowly drifted from daily headlines into documentaries, books, and true crime discussions. But for those whose lives had been touched by the events of 2012, there was no neat ending. There rarely is. Real tragedies do not conclude when a judge leaves the bench. They continue in empty chairs at family gatherings. They continue in birthdays that arrive without the person who should be there. They continue in memories that surface unexpectedly years later. For June Lin's family, The conclusion of the trial marked the end of one journey and the beginning of another. The search for answers had ended. The fight for justice had succeeded. But grief does not follow court schedules. Grief moves according to its own rules. Thousands of miles away from Montreal, family members carry the weight of a loss that no verdict could erase. Before his death, June Lin had been building a future. Like countless immigrants before him, he had left behind familiarity and comfort in pursuit of opportunity. He had crossed oceans, learned new systems, adapted to a new culture, worked toward educational goals, built friendships, made plans. The future stretched ahead of him with possibilities still unwritten. All of those possibilities vanished in a single night. One of the most heartbreaking realities of homicide is that it steals more than a life. It steals futures. The future victim imagined. The future family members expected. The future friends believed they would share together. In the aftermath of the trial, many who knew June Lin spoke less about the crime and more about the person. They remembered his smile, his kindness, his quiet sense of humor, his intelligence, his willingness to help others. The details varied depending on who was speaking, but the theme remained consistent. June Lin was more than a victim. He was a son, a friend, a student, a human being whose identity deserved to exist beyond the circumstances of his death. That distinction mattered, because throughout the investigation and trial, media attention had often focused on Luca Magnotta. His behavior, his background, his actions, his obsession with fame. The danger in many high-profile criminal cases is that the offender becomes famous while the victim slowly fades into the background. Many people who follow the case worked deliberately to prevent that from happening. They wanted June Lin remembered not for how he died, but for how he lived. Meanwhile, criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals continued studying the case. Not because of its notoriety alone, but because it contained warning signs that had appeared years before the murder. One of the most frequently discussed elements involved the videos of animal cruelty that Magnotta had uploaded online. Long before June Lin entered his life, disturbing footage had already drawn attention from internet communities around the world. Viewers watched in horror as animals were tortured and killed. Many immediately recognized the behavior as dangerous. Some became convinced that the person responsible would eventually escalate. At the time, their warnings often seemed extreme. After all, predicting future violence is extraordinarily difficult. Not every individual who harms animals goes on to murder people. Human behavior is rarely that simple. Yet when researchers later reviewed the timeline, the progression became impossible to ignore. The cruelty had not disappeared. It had intensified. The need for shock had grown. The desire for attention had expanded, and eventually, a human being became the victim. For many experts, the case reinforced the importance of taking certain forms of violent behavior seriously, even when they initially appear isolated or directed toward animals rather than people. Another aspect of the case that fascinated researchers was Magnotta's relationship with fame. Traditionally, many serial offenders sought secrecy. They wanted control, power, dominance. But Magnotta appeared driven by something slightly different. Again and again, evidence suggested he craved visibility, attention, recognition. He wanted audiences. He wanted viewers. He wanted people talking about him. The internet provided exactly the environment where those desires could flourish. In previous generations, an individual seeking notoriety might have struggled to reach large audiences. By the early 2010s, a single video could spread across continents within hours. Social media platforms amplified attention. News organizations reacted quickly. Online communities dissected every detail. The digital world created opportunities for instant visibility unlike anything humanity had experienced before. The Magnotta case became one of the earliest major criminal investigations to reveal how deeply internet culture could intersect with violent crime. Law enforcement agencies learned important lessons from the experience. Investigators discovered that online behavior could offer crucial evidence. Digital footprints often proved as valuable as physical ones. Photo post, search histories, messages, uploaded content, metadata. All of these elements became critical investigative tools. The case demonstrated that modern crime scenes often extend far beyond physical locations. Sometimes they exist on servers, websites, and social platforms scattered across the globe. The investigation also highlighted something remarkable about ordinary people. Long before police launched their international manhunt, groups of internet users had been attempting to identify the person responsible for the animal cruelty videos. Most were not detectives. Most had no formal training. They were simply individuals disturbed by what they had seen. Working together, they analyzed backgrounds, objects, reflections, timestamps, and countless other details. They compared information, shared theories, followed leads. Although their efforts were imperfect and sometimes controversial, they demonstrated the extraordinary power of collective online investigation. Years later, their story would become widely known through documentaries examining how internet communities tracked clues connected to Magnata. The case became a cultural landmark, not merely because of the murder itself, but because it reflected a changing world. A world where crimes could be broadcast globally, where digital evidence could cross borders instantly, where ordinary citizens could participate in investigations, and where attention itself could become a powerful motive. For Canadian law enforcement, the successful resolution of the case reinforced the value of international cooperation. The murder occurred in Montreal. The victim was originally from China. The suspect fled through Europe. The arrest occurred in Germany. Evidence traveled across multiple jurisdictions. Without cooperation between agencies, solving the case would have been far more difficult. Instead, authorities shared information rapidly and effectively. The result was a coordinated response that ultimately brought the suspect to justice. Yet despite the investigative success, difficult questions remained. Could warning signs have been recognized earlier? Could intervention have occurred before violence escalated? Could someone so openly seeking attention through disturbing acts have been stopped sooner? There are rarely easy answers. Hindsight often creates the illusion that events were inevitable. In reality, human behavior is complicated. Most warning signs are only obvious after tragedy occurs. Still, the questions remain valuable because they encourage societies to examine prevention rather than merely punishment. Years after the trial, the story continued to resonate. Students studied it in criminology courses. Psychologists analyzed it. Journalists revisited it. Documentary filmmakers explored it. The public remained fascinated and disturbed by the unusual combination of internet culture, fame-seeking behavior, animal cruelty, homicide, and international pursuit. But beneath every analysis lies a simpler truth. A man named June Lin lost his life. Everything else came afterward. The investigations, the headlines, the documentaries, the debates, the court proceedings, the cultural discussions. All of it began because one person made a series of choices that ended another person's future. Perhaps that is the most important lesson hidden within the complexity of the case. Crime stories often become dominated by mystery, evidence, and criminal psychology. The details can become so consuming that people forget the human cost at the center. The Luca Magnotta case reminds us how dangerous that can be. Because while the world became fascinated by the killer, a family was mourning a son. While news networks analyzed the fugitive's movements, friends were grieving someone they loved. While millions discussed the investigation, an empty place remained at dinner tables, celebrations, and family reunions. Justice, when it finally arrived, mattered deeply. It affirmed responsibility. It acknowledged truth. It protected society. But justice and healing are not the same thing. One comes from courts. The other takes far longer. Today, the case remains one of the most infamous crimes in Canadian history. Not simply because of its brutality, but because it revealed how violence, technology, and the pursuit of attention can intersect in terrifying ways. It showed how warning signs can emerge years before tragedy. It demonstrated the growing importance of digital investigations. And it highlighted the extraordinary efforts of investigators across multiple countries who refused to stop searching. Most importantly, it serves as a reminder of June Lin himself. A student, a dreamer, a son who traveled far from home, seeking a better future. His story deserved to continue for decades. Instead, it was cut short. And that is why, Beyond every headline and every documentary, the lasting legacy of this case should never be the notoriety of the killer. It should be the memory of the life that was lost, the pursuit of justice that followed, and the enduring reminder that behind every true crime story stands a real human being whose absence can never truly be measured. Years after the verdict, long after television cameras packed away their equipment and reporters moved on to newer headlines, the story of Luca Magnotta and June Lin continued to cast a long shadow. Some crimes fade from public memory. This was not one of them. Part of the reason was the brutality. Part of it was the international manhunt. Part of it was the internet, where traces of a case remained permanently preserved in news archives, discussion forums, documentaries, and court records. But perhaps the deepest reason was that the case seemed to embody fears that belonged to the modern world. It was a crime born in an era when attention could be measured in clicks. An era when a person sitting alone in a room could broadcast themselves to millions. An era when notoriety could travel faster than truth. As the years passed, criminologists continued to examine the case from every possible angle. Universities discussed it. Law enforcement agencies studied it. Psychologists analyzed it. The questions never fully disappeared. What creates someone whose desire for attention becomes stronger than empathy? How does a person reach the point where human suffering becomes a tool for self-promotion? Could the path have been interrupted years earlier? No single answer ever emerged. Human behavior rarely offers simple explanations. Those who had known Luca Magnotta before the murder often described someone who seemed to be performing constantly. Even ordinary conversations could feel rehearsed. Stories changed depending on the audience. Facts became exaggerated. Reality sometimes appeared secondary to image. Again and again, former acquaintances described a person who desperately wanted to be seen. Desperately wanted recognition. Desperately wanted significance. For most people, those desires are normal. Everyone wants acceptance. Everyone wants validation. Everyone wants to feel important. But in rare cases, those desires can become distorted. The pursuit of attention stops being a means to an end. It becomes the end itself. And when that happens, the need for attention can begin to overpower judgment. Looking back, many observers saw a pattern stretching years before the murder of June Lin. The animal cruelty videos, the fake stories, the endless attempts to generate publicity, the constant creation of online identities. Each event seemed insignificant when viewed alone. Together, they formed a disturbing trajectory, a road leading toward something darker. Meanwhile, the memory of June Lin remained alive among those who loved him. For his family, time moved differently than it did for the rest of the world. News cycles ended. Documentaries premiered. Books were published. But grief followed its own schedule. There were birthdays without him. Holidays without him. Phone calls that would never come. Moments when someone saw a photograph unexpectedly and felt the loss all over again. People often imagine grief as something that gradually disappears. The reality is different. For many families, grief simply changes shape. But the absence remains. A chair stays empty. A voice stays silent. A future remains unfinished. June Lin had crossed an ocean searching for opportunity. He had pursued education. He had built friendships. He had imagined decades of experiences still waiting ahead. The tragedy of homicide is not only the life that ends. It is the life that never gets the chance to happen. The career that never develops. The family that never forms. The dreams that remain permanently incomplete. That reality stayed with those who knew him. Friends remembered his intelligence, his kindness, his willingness to listen, his curiosity about the world. The characteristics that defined his life were often overshadowed by discussions of his death. Yet those closest to him understood something important. The crime was only a single chapter. His life contained many more. As years passed, another conversation began to emerge from the case. The role of internet communities. Long before police identified Magnotta as a murder suspect, groups of strangers online had become obsessed with tracking the individual responsible for the animal cruelty videos. Many of them had never met each other. They lived in different countries, worked different jobs, spoke different languages, yet they shared a common goal. They wanted accountability. They wanted answers. Using little more than publicly available information, they analyzed photographs, videos, furniture, electrical outlets, posters, clothing, and countless tiny details. What began as amateur investigation eventually became one of the most remarkable examples of online crowdsourcing in criminal history. Their efforts were imperfect. Mistakes were made. At times, innocent people were wrongly suspected. The process revealed both the strengths and dangers of digital investigations. But it also demonstrated something powerful. Ordinary people were no longer passive observers. Technology had transformed them into participants. That shift would influence countless future investigations. Law enforcement agencies increasingly recognized the value of public assistance. At the same time, they learned the importance of verifying information carefully. The internet could generate valuable leads. It could also generate misinformation at extraordinary speed. The Magnotta case became an early lesson in navigating both realities. Technology itself occupied a strange role throughout the story. It helped create the crime's notoriety. It helped investigators solve the crime. It helped the public follow the investigation. And it helped preserve the memory of what happened. The same tools that amplified violence also contributed to accountability. That paradox remains relevant today. Modern societies continue to struggle with questions about online platforms, digital fame, and public attention. The case serves as a reminder that technology is neither inherently good nor inherently evil. Its impact depends largely on the choices people make. For investigators involved in the case, certain memories never faded. Years later, many still remembered specific moments with remarkable clarity. The discovery of evidence, the realization that the crime was real, the international coordination required to track the suspect. The moment confirmation arrived from Berlin. Those memories became permanent fixtures in their careers. Most detectives spend years solving difficult cases. Very few encounter one that attracts worldwide attention. Fewer still encounter one that reshapes discussions about crime in the digital age. For the officers who worked the investigation, the case became part of their professional identity. Yet many of them emphasized the same point repeatedly. Behind every headline stood a victim. Behind every piece of evidence stood a human being. That perspective helped anchor the investigation amid overwhelming publicity. As time passed, public fascination with the case gradually evolved. Initial shock gave way to analysis. People became less interested in the gruesome details and more interested in understanding the larger lessons. The dangers of obsession, the warning signs of escalating violence, the psychology of notoriety, the impact of internet culture, the importance of international cooperation, the role of forensic science. Each topic generated discussion. Each offered insights extending beyond a single criminal case. And yet, despite all the analysis, some aspects remained impossible to fully explain. Human beings often search for reasons. We want crimes to make sense. We want clear motivations. We want simple answers. But reality is rarely that cooperative. Sometimes a person commits an act so shocking that understanding remains incomplete. The evidence explains what happened. It explains how it happened. It may even partially explain why. But some questions linger forever. The Luca Magnotta case contains many such questions. Perhaps it always will. What remains certain is that the story left a lasting impact on everyone involved. It changed lives, changed careers, changed conversations, changed investigations. It became one of those rare cases that serves simultaneously as a criminal investigation, a psychological study, a media phenomenon, and a cautionary tale. Most importantly, it remains a reminder of the value of human life. The headlines focused on the killer. The documentaries explored the manhunt. The court proceedings examined evidence. But the true center of the story was never Luca Magnotta. The true center was June Lin, a son, a friend, a student, a person who trusted another human being and paid the ultimate price. When people remember this case years from now, that should be the detail that matters most. Not the fame the killer desperately sought. Not the attention he spent years chasing. Not the notoriety that briefly made him a global headline. Attention FUD. Headlines disappear. Fame is temporary. But the impact of a life, and the loss of that life, endures far longer. And perhaps that is the final irony of the entire story. A man obsessed with being remembered became infamous. Yet the lesson history continues to draw from the case is not about him. It is about the victim he left behind, the people who fought for justice, and the enduring truth that no amount of notoriety can ever outweigh the value of a single human life. To understand why the Luca Magnotta case continues to fascinate criminologists more than a decade after the murder of June Lin, it is necessary to look beyond the crime scene, beyond the courtroom, and beyond the international manhunt. The deeper story lies inside a question that has troubled psychologists for years. What happens when a person's hunger for attention becomes stronger than their connection to reality? Long before his name appeared on international wanted posters, Luca Magnotta seemed to be living inside a carefully constructed fantasy. People who encountered him often described someone who was constantly reinventing himself. One day he presented himself as a successful model. Another day, he claimed connections to celebrities. Stories appeared and disappeared. Details changed depending on who was listening. Facts seemed less important than the image he wanted to project. Many people exaggerate aspects of their lives. Social media has made that behavior common. People post flattering photographs, highlight achievements, and hide failures. Most of the time, these actions remain harmless. But in rare cases, the gap between reality and fantasy grows so wide that maintaining the illusion becomes an obsession. For Magnotta, attention appeared to function almost like a drug. Every photograph, every online post, every mention of his name offered a brief sense of validation. Yet validation fades quickly. The satisfaction never lasts. The individual begins searching for stronger ways to attract notice. The cycle repeats itself. The need grows larger. Experts who later examined the case noticed something significant. Before the murder, Magnotta had already demonstrated a pattern of escalating behavior. He did not suddenly emerge from anonymity and commit a shocking crime. Instead, he spent years attempting to place himself in front of audiences. His modeling career never reached the heights he appeared to desire. His acting ambitions failed to generate meaningful fame. His online presence attracted attention, but not enough to satisfy him. The spotlight remained just out of reach. Then came the animal cruelty videos. To many observers, those videos represented more than simple acts of cruelty. They appeared to be performances. The videos were recorded, edited, and uploaded specifically for viewers. The suffering itself was not enough. There had to be an audience. That distinction matters. Many violent offenders commit crimes in secret because they fear consequences. Magnotta seemed to crave recognition. The audience became part of the experience. Psychologists have long studied the relationship between narcissism and criminal behavior. It is important to understand that narcissism exists on a spectrum. Not every narcissistic person becomes violent. In fact, most never do. However, extreme narcissistic traits can create dangerous conditions when combined with other factors. Individuals with severe narcissistic tendencies may become preoccupied with admiration. Criticism feels unbearable. Failure becomes humiliating. Ordinary life seems insufficient. They may view themselves as deserving of special treatment while simultaneously feeling overlooked by the world. When reality refuses to match their self-image, resentment can grow. Some researchers believe that Magnotta's behavior reflected this dynamic. The world did not provide the level of attention he believed he deserved. Rather than adjusting his expectations, he intensified his efforts to force the world to notice him. The internet provided the perfect environment for that pursuit. By the early 2010s, online platforms had transformed the way people interacted with fame. In previous generations, becoming widely known required access to television, film studios, newspapers, or major organizations. Suddenly, anyone with a camera and an internet connection could potentially reach millions. The barriers had disappeared. Attention became more accessible than ever before. At the same time, attention became easier to measure. Views, comments, shares, and likes created numerical indicators of popularity. People could watch their influence rise or fall in real time. For someone already obsessed with recognition, this environment could become intoxicating. The Magnotta case emerged during a period when society was still learning how digital culture could shape behavior. Today, discussions about viral fame, online influence, and attention-seeking are common. In 2012, many of these conversations were only beginning. The case forced people to confront uncomfortable questions. Could publicity itself motivate violence? Could media coverage unintentionally reward offenders seeking notoriety? How should journalists report on crimes committed by individuals who desperately want attention? These questions remain relevant today. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case was the apparent theatrical nature of the crime. Investigators found evidence suggesting planning, staging, and deliberate efforts to create maximum impact. The murder itself was horrifying enough, yet the surrounding actions suggested an additional objective: visibility. The crime was not hidden. It was documented, distributed, publicized. The audience appeared to matter. This characteristic distinguished the case from many traditional homicides. The goal seemed larger than the act itself. The crime became part of a broader effort to create a global spectacle. Ironically, the very attention Magnotta sought ultimately contributed to his downfall. After fleeing Canada, he traveled across Europe while news organizations around the world broadcast his image. His face appeared on television screens, newspaper covers, and websites across multiple countries. Millions of people became familiar with his appearance. The international publicity made anonymity nearly impossible. Then came one of the strangest moments in modern criminal history. According to investigators, Magnotta was eventually recognized in a Berlin internet cafe while reading news reports about himself. The image feels almost symbolic. A man obsessed with fame sits before a screen, consuming stories about his own notoriety, unaware that the attention he spent years chasing is helping authorities close in on him. The spotlight he desired had become a trap. For criminologists, the case illustrates a broader principle about notoriety-driven offenders. Fame can function as both motivation and vulnerability. The desire for recognition often leaves traces. Publicity creates exposure. Exposure creates opportunities for identification. Unlike offenders who prioritize secrecy, attention-seeking criminals frequently reveal themselves through their own behavior. The digital footprints become impossible to erase completely. Every search, every upload, every interaction, every attempt to generate attention leaves evidence behind. The case also sparked renewed discussion about early warning signs. Could intervention have occurred before violence escalated? The animal cruelty videos remain central to this debate. Many experts emphasize that animal abuse alone does not predict future homicide. Most individuals who harm animals do not become murderers. However, repeated acts of deliberate cruelty can signal deeper psychological problems that deserve attention. In hindsight, the progression appears obvious. At the time, it was far less clear. This is one of the challenges facing law enforcement and mental health professionals. Human behavior is complex. Predicting future violence with certainty is impossible. Authorities must balance public safety with individual rights. The Magnotta case does not offer simple solutions. What it offers instead is a cautionary example. It demonstrates how dangerous patterns can develop over time, how obsession can intensify, how fantasy can gradually replace reality, how the pursuit of attention can become destructive when left unchecked. More than a decade later, researchers continue to reference the case when discussing internet culture, narcissistic behavior, and violence. Few criminal investigations combine these elements so dramatically. Yet amid all the psychological analysis, one fact remains essential. The purpose of studying offenders is not to glorify them. It is to understand them. Understanding creates opportunities for prevention. Understanding helps investigators recognize warning signs. Understanding helps society protect future victims. The ultimate lesson of the Luca Magnotta case is not that attention-seeking leads inevitably to violence. Millions of people seek attention every day without harming anyone. The lesson is more specific. When obsession with recognition combines with cruelty, manipulation, fantasy, and a growing disregard for human suffering, the results can become catastrophic. And in the center of that catastrophe stood June Lin, a real person whose life became entangled with someone else's obsession. A man who should have been remembered for his future rather than the tragedy that ended it. That reality remains the most important psychological truth of the entire case. Behind every theory, every analysis, every documentary, and every discussion about criminal behavior stands a victim whose story deserves equal attention. Without June Lin, there would be no case study, no headlines, no international manhunt, no courtroom drama, only a life that should have continued, And perhaps that is the most important reminder of all. Years before police agencies around the world would place Luca Magnotta's photograph on wanted posters, a completely different group of people had already become familiar with his face. They were not detectives. They were not forensic experts. They were not government investigators. Most of them had never met one another. They lived in different countries, worked different jobs, and came from vastly different backgrounds. Yet they would become an unexpected part of one of the most disturbing criminal investigations of the digital age. Their story began with a video. In late 2010, a shocking clip appeared online showing a young man killing kittens. The footage spread quickly across websites dedicated to discussing disturbing internet content. Many viewers immediately assumed it was fake. Others desperately wanted to believe it had been staged. But the details were too convincing. The animals were real. The suffering was real. The person behind the camera seemed entirely unconcerned by what viewers would think. For most people, the natural reaction was simple. They watched a few seconds, felt disgusted, and closed the page. A smaller group reacted differently. They became determined to identify the person responsible. What started as outrage gradually evolved into an unofficial investigation. At first, the effort seemed impossible. The video revealed very little. There was no visible face, no obvious location, no identifying information. Just a room, a few pieces of furniture, and a horrifying act of cruelty. Traditional investigators might have dismissed such limited evidence. The internet community did not. Instead, hundreds of strangers began examining every frame. One person focused on the furniture. Another analyzed electrical outlets. Someone else studied shadows, wall decorations, and window placements. Tiny details that most viewers ignored suddenly became clues. The process resembled a massive puzzle. Each participant contributed a small piece. Alone, the pieces meant almost nothing. Together, they began forming a picture. The internet has often been criticized for encouraging shallow attention spans. This investigation revealed its opposite side. Thousands of people devoted extraordinary amounts of time to examining details that measured only inches on a computer screen. Hours became days. Days became weeks. The search continued. As additional animal cruelty videos appeared online, the investigators became even more determined. The pattern disturbed them. This was not a one-time act. The offender appeared to enjoy the attention. In fact, many participants became convinced that he wanted them to watch. That realization changed everything. The videos no longer looked like isolated incidents. They looked like performances. Someone was creating content specifically designed to provoke outrage. Someone wanted an audience. The online investigators began discussing an unsettling possibility. What if the person responsible eventually escalated? History offered reasons for concern. Many violent offenders had demonstrated cruelty toward animals before targeting humans. That connection is often misunderstood. Animal abuse does not automatically predict homicide. Most individuals who commit such acts never become murderers. But repeated acts of deliberate cruelty can serve as warning signs. The internet investigators worried they were witnessing exactly that pattern. As they continued digging, a name repeatedly surfaced. Luca Magnotta. At first, the connection seemed uncertain. The evidence was circumstantial. Photographs appeared similar. Online profiles overlapped. Various clues pointed toward him, but proving it remained difficult. The challenge was compounded by another problem. Magnotta appeared to enjoy manipulating the people searching for him. Fake accounts emerged. False leads appeared. Mysterious messages surfaced online. Some investigators believed he was actively monitoring discussions about himself. Others suspected he was participating directly under anonymous usernames. Whether those suspicions were correct remains debated. What is clear is that confusion followed nearly every step of the investigation. The internet community often found itself chasing shadows. One week, a promising lead would emerge. The next week, it would collapse. Yet the participants continued. They were driven by a shared conviction. If authorities could not identify the offender, perhaps ordinary people could. The effort reflected a new reality of the digital era. Information was no longer controlled exclusively by institutions. Anyone with enough determination could conduct research. Anyone could compare photographs. Anyone could examine public records. Anyone could contribute. The strengths of this approach were obvious. Large groups could analyze enormous amounts of information. Different perspectives generated creative ideas. Geographic boundaries disappeared. Someone in Canada could collaborate instantly with someone in England or South Africa. Yet the weaknesses were equally obvious. Mistakes happened. Rumors spread. Incorrect conclusions gained traction. At one point, innocent individuals found themselves suspected simply because Internet users believed they resembled the offender. The dangers of amateur investigations became impossible to ignore. Despite these problems, the group achieved something remarkable. Years before the murder of June Lin, they had already identified the person they believed was responsible for the animal cruelty videos. The challenge was convincing others. Without direct evidence, law enforcement agencies had limited options. The videos were disturbing, but identifying the creator remained difficult. Jurisdictional issues complicated matters further. Websites operated across multiple countries. Users hid behind anonymous accounts. Evidence disappeared as quickly as it appeared. The investigators felt trapped. They believed they knew who was responsible, yet they lacked the authority to act. Then came May 2012. Everything changed. When news emerged from Montreal about a gruesome homicide and a suspect named Luca Magnotta, many members of the online community experienced a horrifying realization. Their worst fears had come true. The escalation they had worried about for years had become reality. An animal abuser they had spent countless hours tracking was now accused of murder. The shock was profound. For some participants, the news felt deeply personal. They remembered the discussions, the warnings, the concerns, the predictions that violence might escalate. Now a human being was dead. June Lin had lost his life. The tragedy transformed the earlier investigation into something far more serious. Suddenly, the clues gathered by Internet users attracted international attention. Journalists wanted interviews. Documentary producers sought information. Law enforcement agencies reviewed online evidence. The people who had once been dismissed as obsessive hobbyists now possessed valuable insight into the suspect's history. Their experience offered a rare glimpse into his behavior before the murder. What motivated him, how he sought attention, how he manipulated audiences, how he appeared to enjoy provoking reactions. These observations helped researchers understand the broader context of the case. Perhaps the most important lesson involved the nature of modern criminal investigations. For generations, investigations followed a relatively predictable model. Police collected evidence. Witnesses provided information. Authorities solved crimes. The public watched from the sidelines. The Magnotta case challenged that structure. The Internet had created a new category of participant. Ordinary citizens could contribute meaningfully to investigations. They could gather information, analyze data, share findings, identify patterns. This development offered tremendous potential, but it also carried risks. Crowds can be intelligent. Crowds can also be wrong. The challenge lies in balancing public participation with professional oversight. The Magnotta investigation became one of the earliest examples of this new reality. It demonstrated both the power and the limitations of online communities. The Internet investigators correctly recognized dangerous behavior years before the murder. Yet they could not prevent what ultimately happened. That reality continues to haunt many people involved. Some have spoken publicly about feelings of frustration. Others describe lingering guilt despite having done everything they reasonably could. But responsibility belongs only to the person who committed the crime. The investigators did not create the violence. They merely recognized warning signs. If anything, their efforts revealed remarkable determination. Most people would have looked away. Most people would have forgotten. Most people would have moved on. They refused. And because they refused, they documented a critical chapter in the story long before the world understood its significance. Today, their work remains an important case study. Law enforcement agencies increasingly monitor online communities for useful information. Researchers examine how digital crowds solve problems. Technology companies study methods for identifying harmful behavior. Many of those conversations trace their origins back to cases like this one. The story of the Internet hunt is not ultimately a story about amateur detectives. It is a story about vigilance, about ordinary people recognizing cruelty and refusing to ignore it, about individuals separated by oceans who work together because they believe something was wrong. Most importantly, it is a reminder that violence rarely emerges from nowhere. There are often warning signs, patterns, behaviors, signals that become obvious only in hindsight. The challenge is recognizing them in real time. The people who tracked Luca Magnotta attempted exactly that. They saw something disturbing. They paid attention. They sounded alarms. And although they could not prevent the tragedy that followed, their efforts became a remarkable chapter in one of the most infamous criminal cases of the 21st century. Their story serves as both inspiration and warning, a demonstration of what collective determination can achieve, and a reminder that sometimes the darkest threats hide in plain sight, waiting for someone willing to look closely enough to see them.